Let me also introduce Scott Hess. Scott Hess is the Community Development Director at North Ogden City, and I have worked with Scott forever. We worked together in Davis County many years ago, and since then we've gone a lot of different directions. But Scott is co-chair now for the Legislative Committee, and we're glad to have him involved in that. We also have Jason Boal that's normally involved, but Jason indicated that he was not able to be here today, so we will miss him. He's an interesting in an interesting position. He is a planner working with a law firm, which I really commend the law firm for actually hiring a planner to do some of the stuff. So, but Jason won't be here.
Wilf, we didn't introduce you. So, I mean, if you don't know Wilf, you haven't done planning in Utah at all. But Wilf, you were at Davis County, Salt Lake City. You've long followed the legislature. You've got the blog that's active right now, very active on Utah Land Use Institute. So really happy to have you. And I'll be running around in the audience, so feel free to ask questions as you have them during the bills as Wilf explains what's going on. And I'll pass a mic around, so just raise your hand and I'll be watching the crowd.
Okay, so let's get started. The thing that this legislative session was an interesting session, but I say that about every session. They're all interesting in their own unique ways, but this one really got into a lot of interesting areas and bills and did a lot of stuff. And to me, really the most interesting thing is we have worked with the League of Cities and Towns forever and been partners with them and kind of been involved on the land use side and given them advice and so on and so forth. Because of things that have occurred over the last couple of years, Cameron Deal, the League Executive Director, has turned into a planner. I now confer upon him an honorary planning degree. He worked very extensively on a number of these bills during this last session and knows them better than probably anybody else. So that'll be good to have him involved here along with his staff to talk about some of these bills later on. Last couple of years, a lot of what's been happening in the legislature has been driven by issues with regard to housing affordability. And that has tied directly into another thing that's been happening on a national level that we call zoning reform, or that everybody calls zoning reform. And they've kind of intersected, and it's been a perfect storm, so to speak, because many feel like that one of the answers to housing affordability is reforming zoning at the local government level. And when you talk about what is zoning reform, it means a lot of different things to different people, but essentially one of the main characteristics or features of it is essentially to do away with single-family zoning. And not to do away with it, I'm kind of exaggerating when I say that, but to really open zoning up more so that instead of just single-family homes, by right, you oftentimes will now also jurisdictions will allow duplexes, triplexes, even small apartment buildings to be built in any residential zone. And so that you don't just have exclusive single-family zones anymore. Some communities are doing that across their entire community. Some are doing that in a number of their residential zones, but not all of their residential zones. And while some communities are doing this on their own initiative, some of the most notable, of course, are places like Minneapolis and Seattle and Austin, Texas, and a few others that have done this, and a lot of other smaller communities. But it's been a big issue, a big factor at the state legislative level now as well, where there's been a lot of efforts, and it really got kicked off in California several years ago, and it's spread to a number of other states. We have seen some of that occurring here in the state of Utah. There's certainly been discussion about it, but I will again credit the league to say that they have been very active in working with legislators and saying, let the communities basically guide this process and come up with the policies and the ways to do this. And by and large, the legislature has allowed that to occur. And you can see that with some of the bills that were passed during this session. Whereas in many other places, it's really the zoning reform becomes a top-down mandate where the state says, thou shalt do this, local governments. Here in the state of Utah, it's been much more of a collaborative effort between states, the state and the local jurisdictions. And they have developed cooperatively some measures that are more of options rather than they are mandates. And we'll see a little bit about that. But just again, to emphasize that, this whole housing supply accelerator program, which was kicked off, gosh, Cam, how long has it been? A year and a half now that it's been going? This is a joint effort between APA National and the National League of Cities. The whole purpose of it was to discuss this issue of zoning reform and what to do with regard to housing and what's happening with the cost of housing and how to address that. And there is a board that was put together at the national level with representation from both APA and from the league, and we actually have a Utah representative on that board. It's Mayor Shepard from Clearfield, who is involved on that board. So at this point, I guess I can say that I really haven't seen a whole lot concrete come out of that effort, but there's been a lot of discussion and a lot of education, I guess, and information. And that continues, and I think we'll continue to see that, and we'll talk about that as far as with regard to what happens in the future. As we go over some of these bills we're going to talk about, if you have questions or comments about them, Scott's going to wander around with a microphone. Just shoot your hand up in the air, and Scott will come over with the microphone. And Scott may also be the disembodied voice that chimes in here on occasion on some of these bills. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. This is, again, the issue of zoning reform, as we have seen it in a lot of places, is really a top-down mandate. We had a bill that was much more in the vein of what you see typically happening in other states with regard to zoning reform. It was House Bill 306 in this last legislative session. What that bill would have done is it would have, first of all, it would have defined what is a starter home, because the governor has been very emphatic about needing to build more starter homes in the state of Utah. He is saying that he wants to see 35,000 new starter homes built in, is it 5 years? 5 years. That's a pretty tall order. The question really kind of was, so what is a starter home? And this particular bill, which was by Representative Ray Ward out of Bountiful, which he kind of put out there on his own without really a lot of discussion with anybody else, it would have defined what a starter home was and would have made them permitted in all residential zones with some minimum square footage or maximum square footage allotments and some other definitions, cost. And then it would have, the bill would have also said that lots as small as 5,400 square feet can be approved and built in any residential zone and in any community. So many communities have, like, for example, 10,000 square foot lot zones, some bigger than that. Under that bill, in any zone, including in those R10 zones or others, lots could be approved for starter homes down to 5,400 square feet. Now, because that bill was not collaborative and wasn't really talked through, it wound up not going anywhere. The leadership did not support the bill, nor did the municipalities and local governments. But we did get a bill like that, which is, as I say, more typical of what we're seeing happening in other places around the country. And will we get something like that in the future? In an upcoming legislative session? You never know the bills that are going to pop up, but there's been plenty of discussion, so the success of that kind of bill probably will not happen unless it's something that's more or less collaboratively agreed upon. So we shall see what happens in the future. And as I say, in the state of Utah, I think we're getting known for the fact that we're addressing this issue on a much more collaborative basis than has been happening in many other states. All right. The big bills, the big ones that came out that provide some real interesting options to address housing affordability. I'm going to flip it, and we're going to talk about some of the more detailed land use administration kinds of bills because we seem to never get around to those because we don't have a lot of time. And part of the reason I want to save those big bills for last because we may not have a lot of time to talk about them in here, but they will be addressed much more in the session following in this room that I mentioned up front with the league staff. So you'll certainly get the opportunity to hear a lot more of the detail about those bills there. So let's talk about some of those bills on the land use administration side. Typically what we see in a lot of legislative sessions, a lot of it coming out of what is called the Land Use Task Force, and we've talked about that enough, I think, over time that you're aware of that. But one of the big bills that did kind of come out of all of this was a bill that basically puts into place the regulatory framework for building modular homes and allowing modular homes to be built and located in the state of Utah. The idea there being that modular homes are less expensive to build, therefore more affordable, are easier to put into place, and just by virtue of how they work, they are one of the answers to the housing affordability issue. Rather than allowing each or seeing that each individual jurisdiction adopts their own regulations with regard to these types of homes, the modular homes, this particular bill puts into place standards and criteria on a statewide basis. And the hope is that it will encourage the modular home industry to locate a facility here in the state of Utah and then allow for more affordable options to be located. This bill was broadly supported, both on the local government side and in the industry side. So it was a pretty good consensus bill. Everybody felt pretty good about this bill. And it's in place now, and we'll see how things develop on this going forward. House Bill 465, there were some other changes here that were made with regard to the moderate income housing plan. There were some revisions made. There were no substantial changes made for the menu items or the reporting timelines for those moderate income housing plans. You're all, I think most of you, all of you are aware of the changes that have been made in recent years. But this bill does now require that you include information on your zoning map. The idea there being is to be able to identify where entitled housing can be built and to give a better assessment of how many units might be possible to be built so we have a better handle on what may actually be possible or feasible with regard to building new housing in the future. What it really asks, and the bottom line of all of this, is to take your data collection seriously so that we get a better picture of what's happening with the housing market and with housing availability throughout the state of Utah. So just be aware of some of the changes that are being made there. Timing of the reports and the things like the options that you have available to choose from and so on, nothing really changed there. Just some of this additional information that's needed in the reporting. This was the big land use task force bill where a number of different administrative type of issues were addressed. And here's a list of all of those various administrative issues. We'll run through them here fairly quickly to give you an idea of the kinds of things that are addressed there and what you may need to be doing. You're all aware, of course, of the bills that were passed over the last session or two with regard to subdivisions, the changes that you need to make to your local zoning codes, or I'm sorry, to your local subdivision codes, and how you do the process now of approving subdivision plats. This bill did some additional changes to that. Part of some of the question that remained from the previous bills was where you do, at what stage in the subdivision process can you and are you allowed to do the engineering improvements for a subdivision, and where do you address that? Some communities were addressing that at the preliminary plat stage, some were addressing it at the final plat stage, some were addressing it at both stages, and that kind of seemed to be a little bit counterproductive to what the main goal of this was, which was to kind of streamline that subdivision approval process, review and approval process. This bill kind of defined that a little bit better. Basically, in essence, I think what it says is that you can do the engineering standards review at either the preliminary or the final, but not both. Do it at one or the other. and take care of it at that stage, but don't drag it out over a couple of different stages of the subdivision approval process, and with the timing of those reviews. Just something to be aware of. A lot of the other stuff still remains in place with regard to the subdivision approval process. One of the things that I find that people who are here, like that are planning commissioners or council members, it's always interesting for them to find out that in the subdivision plat approval process, planning commissions now can still play a role, but it's a much more limited role, and councils have no role at all anymore. Always gets a reaction from council members, because a lot of times they're like, wait, what? I don't get to deal with subdivision plats anymore? That's one of the reasons I ran for election, was because I didn't like a subdivision that was going in near my house. But, there's rationale behind it and consensus behind it, and that's the process that's in place. So just be aware of that. There were also some questions with regard to phasing of subdivisions and other kinds of development projects as well. In some communities, they were not allowing a developer who had a multi-phase project to engage in a new phase until the previous phase was completed. And that really seemed to be counterproductive on a lot of fronts. So what this bill now says is that you cannot make the fact that a earlier phase is not yet complete a basis for holding up action on a subsequent phase. So let's say you have a multi-phase subdivision, the developer is working on the first phase of the subdivision, work is still underway on that phase, now they want to go ahead and proceed and begin work on the second phase. That needs to be allowed. A community can no longer say, you have to complete phase 1 first before we'll allow you to begin work on phase 2. So kind of a detailed one to be aware of. There were some provisions with regard to landscaping. Again, a lot of these are driven by what's been happening in communities, and what this bill now says is that a certificate of occupancy for a structure that has been built in a development cannot be withheld because the homeowner has not completed the landscaping. So part of that is driven by the fact that a lot of times homes may be completed in the wintertime. The owners are ready to move in, the new owners are ready to move in, and they can't put in the landscaping yet. And yet we did have instances where some communities were saying, until you put that landscaping in, we're not issuing a certificate of occupancy and you can't move in. That's no longer allowed under the provisions of this bill. Scott?
And this is for single family only, right?
Yes.
So multifamily commercial, you can still do that if that's what your code
Yes,
allows.
that's correct. This applies only to single family developments. And it also allows a municipality to inform new residents of the city's requirement that they may have to do water-wise landscaping, so that they're aware of that. Development agreements. There was a lot of discussion about development agreements in the Land Use Task Force during the interim last year, and there were some provisions that were passed in this bill. I guess what I would really say to you is, talk to your city attorney or talk to one of the attorneys that has been involved in this to get a clearer understanding of what this really does with regard to how you do development agreements, what you can and maybe can't do. I have gotten several calls from planners saying, a typical one was from a planner that said, our city attorney and I have been looking over this bill, and what we really seem to think it says is that we can't do development agreements anymore unless there's something that, we're trying to do that doesn't fit into the normal provisions of the zoning code or whatever. And in essence, that is kind of what it says. I talked to one of our illustrious city attorneys who used to be involved extensively in legislative issues, and the advice he kind of gave me, or what he said was, just make sure that in your development agreement that you include something in there that would need a legislative action. In other words, it's something that's not normally allowed by your zoning code, but then you can have really a full, extensive development agreement that it will cover a lot of other areas, but something that's also in there that would need to have legislative action. You're allowing for something that your code would not normally allow for. But the language in this provision now does say that you cannot require a development agreement for things that are normally allowed under your code. Scott, anything there? Or
I just think in your processes, it highlights the importance of understanding the legislative decision making versus the administrative. And when a developer comes in, if it's a pre-existing zone that you would accept any other development in, you just can't require that. So think about the zones you have, the developments you have, and have those discussions with the developer up front, because you can obtain that development agreement during the rezone process, general plan,
Right.
process, any of those legislative actions.
Right.
But it has to be explicitly during that part, not during the administrative part.
Right, yeah, good point. Good way to explain it, Scott, thanks. There was a lot of discussion also about what are called like landings or the rear setbacks with regard to landings. A lot of times you'll have like stairs that come out of the back of a home, and at the bottom of the stairs, the developer would put in a landing. Some communities were not allowing those landings to go in if they were within the required rear yard setback area. Some would, some wouldn't, and it was kind of an inconsistent situation. Also, a lot of times you might have homes that have a rear deck on the back of the house at the ground level, particularly even, and sometimes those were not allowed either. There was a lot of discussion about how that can affect housing affordability, because then the developers have to change their plans, and a lot of other issues that went with that. And so this provision was adopted into this bill, where it says basically you can have by right a 32 square foot landing area in a required rear yard setback. So there's basically a uniform standard throughout the state with regard to this. Sidewalk phasing has also been an issue. A lot of the complaints from the developers were the fact that they were oftentimes required to put in sidewalks up front in a new subdivision or a new development proposal. And then as they would construct, they of course their equipment would go over the sidewalk, would break up the sidewalk. That sidewalk would have to be replaced, but as they would complete the building, then the question was, do they replace just the few sections that are broken now, or do they wait and do all of it at one time, or maybe not even put the sidewalk in at all until they're finished with the building and development? So there was some language that was adopted here that addressed this whole issue of sidewalk phasing and what a local jurisdiction can require in order to makes the standard a little bit more uniform and probably a little bit more common sense with regard to not having construction constantly breaking sidewalk because it was required to be put in, and then it's going to get broken up during the construction process. I'm sure you're all aware that a couple of years ago that the legislature passed a provision with regard to not allowing communities to require design standards for single-family and two-family homes. And there were some provisions with regard to that, particularly in places where you had danger of overblast pressure zones, particularly on the west side of Salt Lake County. And there are some other areas like near refineries and near some military facilities. The provision was adopted that does allow design standards to be imposed on those homes in areas that are subject to overpressure blast zones. Not a big area, but also just something to be aware of, that was allowed. I just decided to throw this slide in there because we had a lot of effort that went on over a period of probably a couple of years to try and address annexation. That was supposed to have happened during this last legislative session. It wound up not happening. Really the issue there was because of workload with the staff person. The person that was at the legislative staff level that would have been doing this was, he got a lot of work with some of these other big bills that came forward, and so he just could not get around to doing the annexation. And we are promised, once again, that it will happen this coming legislative session, so we shall see. There may be some actual recodification of the annexation provisions of the code coming. All right, just quickly to cover this, many of you may have been aware that with regard to the property rights ombudsman and to the advisory opinions, that if court cases went forward, there was a provision in there that talked about the fact that if someone went forward and a court case was decided in consistent with what the advisory opinion from the ombudsman said, that court costs could be recovered by the successful party. It was vague. It never really happened. There were some other provisions that were now included in this, and it does talk about that. I won't go into the detail, but you can kind of see the language up here. Probably in most cases, you're not going to have to deal with this or face this, but just be aware that there is some language in there with regard to recovering legal costs with regard to advisory opinions if they move forward into actually going to the courts. This was an interesting bill and had a lot of discussion. What has wound up with that now is that all cities, all local governments in the state are required to have a third-party inspection list, a list of inspectors, third-party inspectors that are not city employees or municipal employees, local employees, that a builder can choose from if the local building inspector cannot complete the inspection within the 3 days required by state code. On that fourth day, that builder can then take your list and choose an inspector that is on that list. So you just need to be aware that you need to have a list that gives acceptable inspectors that may be available, third-party inspectors, and that if your own municipal inspector is not able to complete the inspection within the required 3 days of state code, that third-party inspector can be picked and can be used to do the inspection. Cam?
Thanks, Wilf. I just wanted to add a couple of quick tidbits on this bill, if that's all right. Good morning, everybody. Cameron Deal, the director of the Utah League of Cities and Towns. I'll be doing the deep dive after Wilf. But I wanted to just speak up on this bill because I think this bill demonstrates a couple of really important things that's helpful for you to know in your profession, and then also for you to pass along to your mayors and to your council members. When this original bill came out, the initial intent seemed to be to bypass local government inspections and really take local governments out of the process and have builders be able to select their own inspectors. Part of the rationale for the bill was saying that local governments were taking too long to inspect residential units. So during the legislative session, we did a quick survey with the Utah City Management Association, and hopefully many of you saw that survey. We had about 50 cities that responded to that survey, and we were able to get data back within a matter of days. And what that data came back was in the thousands upon thousands of residential inspections that were occurring around the state of Utah, approximately 99% were happening within the 3 days. So yeah, there were examples of inspections that were taking longer than 3 days, but they were a very, 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 very tiny minority of the overall inspections. That data helped turn the tide at the Capitol. The reason I bring this up is because when we reach out through the city managers, or ideally you see it through our Friday Facts email, we're asking for this type of data and this sort of information. It matters and it makes a difference. So how many of you, by quick show of hands, remember getting that survey? Okay, so a handful in the room. Well, the data that you provided, we aggregated, we shared it with key legislators, and it helped. Now, that original version of the bill and the concept of that original version of the bill passed out of the Senate. And the next morning, before it had even been introduced to the House of Representatives, we sent an action alert, and we had mayors and council members contacting their House of Representatives members. And within a couple of hours of sending that email, I actually had a member of the House who was involved in this bill come out and grab me and say, "Call off your dogs. The bill is going to change. We hear you guys loud and clear." So it was a combination of bringing the data that helped complete the narrative of what was really happening on the ground, and mayors and council members making those phone calls to legislators saying, we are very concerned about this policy precedent of taking local governments out of the inspection process because of the risk to health and safety of our residents. As a result, where the bill ultimately came down, and we were comfortable with where the bill ultimately came down, was in those scenarios where you can't get the inspection done in 3 days, having a clear path forward on day 4 to make sure it gets done in a timely way. We ultimately felt like that was a win-win outcome, but it was in large part because of the data collection that many of you helped us with, and because mayors and council members made those phone calls. So there are lots of land use related bills, but I think this bill really illustrates how you as planners, working with your elected officials through APA and the league, can make a positive difference at the Capitol for good outcomes.
Thanks, Cam. Yeah, that's a good example of what had happened on this bill, certainly, and happens on other bills as well, where your municipal officials are involved in making changes to some of these bills, significant changes. So always something to be aware of and to kind of watch for during the legislative session. And we'll try to bring that to your attention, of course, as the sessions move along. There was a provision, there was a bill that was passed that included a provision that said essentially that a building permit cannot be withheld for building on a property where there may already be a non-compliant structure on that property. Not really sure what was driving that particular issue, but the idea being that there may be a building that was located maybe a long time ago and was built without a permit or is really old and out of compliance now. And some communities were saying, well, you know, until we get this structure dealt with, you cannot build anything else on that property. That became an issue and then was worked through in the legislative session. And ultimately, this bill was passed. It says you cannot withhold a building permit for another structure if there is already a non-compliant structure on the property. And of course, the other building could still be located in compliance with the other requirements of the code. We have a question coming, yeah.
Just an additional comment on this. We've already had this provision come into, affect our an issue in our city. There is a provision in the ordinance that says, or in the law that says, you can verify that there's not a life safety issue with the existing building.
Right.
So what we've done has been trying to schedule just a walkthrough with our building inspector to look at it for that issue.
Great, okay, thank you. Thanks, Brandon. Scott, over here.
Thank you. Well, as I understand, this is just pertaining to the issuing of new building permits. But say somebody says, I want to have a home occupation and the city requires a permit for a home occupation. Does that come into play here as well?
What it really addresses is a building permit. So it doesn't really, I don't think it addresses really the things like home occupation permits. It's probably something you can still address as you normally would in your city processes. But that's my opinion. Talk to your attorney and find out. All right. Then we had another bill that addressed one particular issue, but then it was amended and had a whole new section of the LUDMA that was added to it. The bill itself basically initially said that when a building permit is issued, a municipality or a local government cannot add things to that building permit except for things relating to building code compliance. So once you've issued the permit, that's it. You can't add any other things, any other requirements to it subsequent to the issuing of that permit, other than building code issues that may arise. But then there was another whole section that was amended into this bill that dealt with tower cranes, which I found kind of interesting. But I've talked to the attorney that was involved in this, and he said basically there were a lot of issues that were coming up with regard to tower cranes, how they operate and how they sometimes, when they move, of course, they're huge, as you can see and as I'm sure you've seen, and sometimes they sweep over the property line across other properties, and there were some issues with regard to whether that could happen or not. Some of those property owners were saying, you can't have your tower crane, go over my property. So that was addressed and was put into the LUDMA of all places. And there is now an entire section in the LUDMA that addresses tower cranes. So if you ever have an issue with that, you got to make sure that you take a look at that. Let me just put a little editorial comment in here with regard to the LUDMA. The LUDMA is getting very long and very complex. I've kind of jokingly said that unless you take Zen-like examination time to really study and try to figure out the LUDMA, it's going to be hard for you to know if when you're modifying your local zoning codes and land use ordinances, if you've really complied with everything that's in the LUDMA, because there's so much in the LUDMA now, and it continues. We've had hundreds of lines of code added to the LUDMA each year for the last several years. And it's getting very big, very complex, and almost unwieldy. So, just an editorial comment. A lot of times, of course, I know in the past, certainly when I was involved in drafting land use codes, we always wanted to make sure that we hadn't overlooked something, and we would spend a little bit of time looking through the LUDMA to make sure that it was addressing. We were addressing the issues that might have been raised in there. That is getting increasingly more difficult to do. Because it is getting so big and long and complex. All right, enough said on that editorial comment. Let's move on. There was a bill that was passed that created a couple of new educational entities. They are called home-based micro schools and micro-educational facilities. They're essentially like in homes or in structures that oftentimes are in residential areas. They're a new kind of a thing on the education front. They raised a lot of debate by the education community about the appropriateness of them, but there was a lot of support and they wind up passing. On the land use side, what you need to be aware of with regard to these is that they were given the same exemptions or the same provisions that charter schools have with regard to land use codes. In other words, charter schools are allowed in all zones in your community, any zone. The same now will hold true of these home-based micro schools and micro educational entities. And there are other provisions that charter schools are exempt from your local codes or that you can require to a limited extent. Those also apply to these new micro school or micro educational entities. Just something you need to be aware of. You may begin to get calls as some homeowner establishes a home-based micro school and has a number of kids, and there is a maximum number that they're allowed to have in this, but have all these kids starting to show up, and the question may come to you is, well, I didn't see that you guys issued any kind of permit to allow them to do that. That's because those kinds of entities now will enjoy the same kinds of exemptions that charter schools enjoy. Yes.
So, Wilf, we just recently modified our land use code dealing with child care facilities. Is there enough distinction between a preschool and a home versus these that we can make that clear?
I mean, there is a definition of what a micro educational entity and a home-based micro school is in the state code. They're really not daycare facilities. They're not intended to be that. So I think you're still safe in having your regulation with regard to child care facilities. But I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if we see some conflict or some overlap showing up there. So we'll see what happens. You may recall that in the last legislative session there was a bill that was passed that required a local entity that was within 5,000 feet of a military facility or a military base that they needed to. Originally, the bill was going to require that all permits were submitted to the State Office of Veteran and Military Affairs for their review prior to you being able to issue a permit with regard to that. This bill modifies that now and basically just says that those kinds of permits within 5,000 feet, they are submitted to the facility for comment, but not for review and approval. So you just have to be aware of that. It does require that If you're within 5,000 feet of a military base, any land uses that go on there have to be done in compliance or in review with the compatible use plan. Most military facilities require that they have a compatible use plan that they developed jointly with the community around the base. This is just trying to get you to comply with that plan, or at least consider that plan as you look at approving future permits for development, even homes within the 5,000 feet. Now, 5,000 feet is quite a ways. So, you're looking, I look at, for example, the area around Hill Air Force Base. You're kicking out quite a ways, a mile away from the base. That requires this to happen. So just something to be aware of. All right. Now, we'll talk here briefly about these. These are the big bills. These are the ones that really relate to the housing affordability and the zoning reform that I talked about at the beginning. And I'm going to touch on these bills briefly just to give you an idea, but we're not going to get into them in a lot of detail. As I say, stay in here for the session following where Cam and his staff will talk about these bills a little bit more in detail. And they are great to do that because Cam and his staff were very involved in the drafting of these bills and know them quite well. So there will be a lot of interesting questions to be asked. Now, you may recall that at the beginning, my title slide said, is this really going to work? And I guess that's the question. As you look at some of this, and a lot of us have looked at this and says, wow, these are really great ideas. This will be really good. But are they really going to work? Are the communities really going to go for this, and are the developers really going to build these things or do these things? And I guess only time will tell. I can certainly tell you that the governor is certainly putting a lot of pressure on it, saying, I want to see these things happen. So we shall see. So let's just talk about them. As you are well aware, a few legislative sessions ago, there were the requirements for the establishment of the transit zone, around the transit zones, the HTRZs. There were some modifications made to that in this session so that there would be some consideration given for owner-occupied housing. That's become much more of an issue over the last little while, particularly as we're talking about starter homes and home ownership and the ability to do that. It increases the percent of affordable units within those HTRZs that will be required. The phasing of those housing units, and a couple of other things that regard kind of the administrative details with HTRZs. But just be aware that if you have a transit station within your community and you are considering an HTRZ around that transit station, or you're required to do an HTRZ, or you may already have one in place, there are some changes that were made primarily to kind of address the housing affordability issue and how to try to bring that about in a more smoother manner. This particular bill, the First Home Investment Zone Act, and it's getting the acronym of called FIZ, so these FIZ zones that can be established in communities. This is an option that was put in place, and it's a very detailed bill. As you can see from the graphic that is up here, there's a lot to it that talks about establishing an area. The intent here is to attempt to create more affordable housing in a community, and to tie it in with mixed use and with community centers to try and do something with regard to enhanced walkability in community centers and so on. And so there's a lot of provisions that are related to this. There are also provisions in this that say that you can also do things outside of the FIZ zone, but count what's happening outside of the FIZ zone in what's required in the FIZ zone. So there are a lot of provisions with regard to this. The idea basically being that you're going to increase density, you're going to increase affordability, you're going to increase owner occupancy, the fact that the owner will purchase and live in these types of facilities. Somewhat in this, more so in the next one we'll talk about as well. But this is a great new option. It'll be interesting to see what kind of uptake there is on this. And as I mentioned, the governor says he's watching. So we'll see what happens with regard to this. I won't go into any more details on that. There'll be plenty of discussion on that in the session following this one. The other one is, was part of this particular bill, part of which we've already talked about. But in this bill, it allows for the creation of what's called a home ownership promotion zone, or a HOPS zone, as we're going to call it. So we have FIZs and HOPS. This one is much smaller in scale. This is for up to 10 acres in size. That must be zoned for at least 6 units per acre, so the density is really considerably less than what is oftentimes called for in the FIZ zones. But still, 6 units per acre is, you're starting to get some smaller lots with regard to that. It establishes some criteria for the affordability based on the county median home sale price. And all of the units have to be owner occupied for at least 5 years. So there has to be a provision in there, an agreement, a development agreement or whatever it is, agreement that goes with that, where that is required. Now the benefit of all of these, the HTRZ, the FIZ, and the HOPS, is that it allows the local entity to capture the tax increment and use that to fund, in a lot of cases, probably the additional infrastructure or putting in the infrastructure for the development in that zone. In this case, in the HOP zone, the increment can be used to help finance the development itself. So if a builder wants to do something like this, but he may not be able to get the financing that he would like to get for it, some of that financing can be provided through the tax increment that comes from this HOPS. So that's an option. That's something that's a viable part of that. So a lot of options here, all with the goal of trying to increase the starter home dynamic. Owner-occupied, affordable housing, which is something that the governor has made a high priority, and we've talked about that a little bit. This is another provision with regard to that. This really doesn't affect your land use provisions directly. What this does is it makes more money available to finance those kinds of developments. This is something that is with regard to the state treasurer, directs the state treasurer to invest up to $300 million of state funds from a specific source to lenders for what are called qualified projects. And qualified projects, again, are those owner-occupied starter home type of affordable housing. And what the state treasurer would do is the state treasurer puts that money, makes it available to a lending institution, and then that lending institution loans that money to a developer or invests in a development at a specified rate of interest that is tied, of course, to other rates of interest, but it's an advantageous financing mechanism and rate in order to encourage that new development to occur. So this is kind of on the financing end of things, not so much on the land use, but something that's intended to encourage the development, and it kind of stresses again the high priority that the governor and other state leaders are putting on the making available and making more feasible owner-occupied starter homes around the state in various communities. And then you're all aware of some of the things that have happened over the last couple of sessions and years with regard to financing of infrastructure with some of these financing districts. Another one was created during this session, the Infrastructure Financing District. It's a little bit different than the PID zones that you all are aware of. That is something that has been happening for the last couple of years now. This one is much more independent of local government involvement directly in the structuring of these. But it does require, of course, that any development that they do, the infrastructure that is put in place must meet the city standards, so they will still have to work with the city in order to make sure that that infrastructure complies and is compatible with what the city infrastructure is. And then there, as a means of financing that, accessing the financing markets that would give them a more advantageous rate of interest in order to put in that infrastructure, and then how those bonds are retired. Making that happen much more quickly, I guess, would be the way to put that, and not tying it so much to the tax rate. or other things that might be involved at the local government level that would compete with what may be happening with that infrastructure district. So just be aware that that's also passed in this session. All right. This particular bill talks again about in redevelopment areas or community redevelopment areas, the requirements that are in place that currently exist with regard to putting in some housing in those redevelopment areas. This particular bill makes some changes to that. One of the things that it does allow is that it allows for a community to enter into an agreement with another community and to use their funding to provide housing in another community, in an adjacent community. So there's a lot more flexibility about how those funds can be used and how they can be structured for those CRAs and RDAs. And it puts some provisions in there on how those funds are to be used as well, on the timing of those funds. So just something to be aware of if you're dealing with any kind of a redevelopment project and the requirements for housing that you have in there. A number of other bills of interest that were passed during the session. There were several. I won't go over all of these in any detail, really. The HB 507, I'm trying to remember now that this is on the construction amendments. Cam, help me real quick. The 507 dealt with, I think, the stormwater. Is that correct? The stormwater requirements. There are some provisions based on federal standards or requirements that a local entity must now do. They must require and certify how stormwater is handled, particularly from construction projects and in other ways. This will probably be subject to some more legislative action because there's still a lot of unanswered questions with regard to how stormwater is to be handled and what is required and what has to be done. There's quite a bit of pushback on some of this as well, so just be aware. But there are provisions now in place that you do need to be aware of as you're working with a development and they have to provide stormwater retention facilities. Question over here? Nope, I think we're good. HB 502 has to do with sand and gravel. The gravel pits issue has been one that's been kicking around for some time, and there's been a lot of back and forth and discussion and lawsuits and everything that have happened. And kind of the intent was, or the understanding was, is that things were going to get discussed and worked out between them. Well, that never really happened. And so this particular bill was going to, in its original form, was going to mandate some things with regard to allowing gravel pit and sand mining operations in communities. Ultimately, the bill was changed and now requires that this be studied by the Division of Oil, Gas, and Mining, and that a report be issued, but that all of the entities that are involved in this study, and that they hopefully will come to some kind of understanding as to how to deal with these facilities in the future. The ultimate is that the report is to be given to the Legislative Committee in November, and then we'll see where that goes and what might happen with that. Some changes were made to the Scenic Byway program. It still exists, but in a more limited form. There were some changes made with regard to municipal and corporations and inland port authorities, and some other things that were that are noted on here. You may just want to take a quick look at those bills. Nothing really earth-shaking or major, but just some issues that you might need to be aware of. And then, of course, there was a lot of attention paid to these Salt Lake City sports redevelopment bills. One for a potential Major League Baseball stadium just south of the fairgrounds, south of North Temple. And the other, of course, for the potential of a hockey team coming, and that potential has now been realized. The hockey team is coming, and you've all probably been hearing about all of the efforts that are going on with what to do with the redesign and redevelopment of the Delta Center and the Salt Palace and other facilities around that area, and the taxes that will go with that, and the other. There's some big deal stuff here. Will the baseball stuff materialize? Don't know. The hockey has materialized. So we'll see some things happen there. But again, this is all pretty specific to Salt Lake City, and will relate to any time you go down there and spend some money, because you're going to be spending a little bit more to help support some of these facilities. There were a number of bills that cropped up during the session. We won't go over these in any detail, but I just encourage you to take a look at this list. It was of interest just to see. A lot of these bills kind of came out of nowhere. I think a lot of us were like, wow, really? Somebody's bringing that up? But there were others that really, once there was not a lot of discussion about them beforehand, and as the ramifications of the bills became obvious, the things kind of withered and died. I think of particularly, there was a particular bill that would have required all communities to include in their general plans addressing riparian areas. That really would have meant a lot of additional work and added a lot of detail again to the general plan. Another one was there was a bill that would have required any new development as part of the analysis of that development to address wildlife issues. Any new development. And so that bill did not pass. All of these bills that are up here did not pass, but it's just interesting to see what comes up and what will likely come up again, and that we'll just need to be aware of and be willing to address and take a look and see what happens with those. Now, as I'm sure you're all aware of and probably anticipate, this ain't over yet. We will surely have additional big issues that are coming up. The Commission on Housing Affordability already has met. They met this last week. And part of what they discussed were things that they are going to be trying to address for the upcoming session. The Commission on Housing Affordability is now a subcommittee of the Unified Economic Opportunity Commission, which really has set the agenda for some of the major land use kinds of things and housing affordability issues that are addressed in the legislature. So there are some provisions that were already discussed that will come up and that'll be discussed. I've got a list of those. We can take a look at those. One of the things y'all may be interested in knowing is that parking provisions are likely to be a big issue that will be discussed during this upcoming session. There are some more financing type of issues with regard to financing of housing affordability and some other local land use provisions. And so there's plenty there to be looked at. There are, well, rather than get into the detail on those, we'll be talking about those. We're going to have all of the time between now and the next legislative session to get into these. Scott?
Wilf, I just wanted to make one comment on transportation fees, because I think this was it was either wrapping up or in the air last year at this time, but the transportation utility fee court case has been finalized, and it was won in favor of jurisdictions. Right. So if you are looking for ways to bolster your B&C road funds or other local funds for transportation, you can do, based on the information in state code, you can do a study, you can understand what your needs are, and essentially apply a fee back to your residents of a certain nominal amount to collect and help with your road and your transportation. So something to look at for your city. It's go ahead, Cam.
How many cities are considering a transportation utility fee this budget cycle? Okay, just a few. Those of you who already have it, you can continue as is. Those of you who are looking to do it, please grab me today, because even though the bill did not pass, that bill really is a safe harbor right now, where all the stakeholders were in support or okay with that bill. And if you follow the process in that bill, you'll set yourself up for success. If you go outside of that bill, you could not just jeopardize your ability to do it, but it would make it complicated for other cities to do transportation utility fees going forward. And I do expect both legislation and litigation in this space going forward. So if your city is interested in doing transportation utility fee, you have the authority to do it. But just look at House Bill 367 and then follow up with me today or with league staff. At some point, we can talk through some of these other political dynamics.
And we got the all done call.
Yeah.
We got the call.
So we'll wrap this up just quickly, just to let you know. I mean, Steve Waldrop yesterday talked about the public lands and trying to make those available for housing. That's one of the big issues. There is going to be discussion about if there should be some typical, more standard zoning reform issues looked at, corporate ownership of housing, and some other regulatory issues. So there's plenty that's going to be looked at, and there'll be plenty more that's going to be talked about as we go through the interim, and we'll try to keep you informed. So we are ready to break here and move on to the next sessions. I know that there are a couple of other sessions some of you need to get to, and those of you who are more interested in what's happening with these bills, stay right here in this session. The league staff will continue with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wilf.
Thanks for doing the legislative deep dive with us. Nothing says a happy Friday like 2+ hours talking about the legislature, and so I anticipate people may be coming and going. We were told to take a little break at some point, but what we hope to do over the next couple of hours, both for those of you who are here now and then the people who may be coming in, is to have a back and forth conversation about which bills you want a better understanding on. Wilf did a nice job doing an overview. I'm actually going to take a step back even further from what Wilf did to just give you the high-level perspective from the League of Cities and Towns about the 2024 legislative session. So you heard Scott's bad joke about being safer with the 591 bills that passed. That is a record. It broke last year's record. Last year was the biggest year until this year. They opened 940 bill files, and bill files are already open for the 2025 session. We as a league tracked 247 of them. And so think about that for a second. There were 247 bills that impacted cities and towns in some way in this past legislative session. So thank you to all of you who participated in some form or fashion. We rely heavily on our membership for the expertise and perspectives. We often say the strength of the league is the membership, because of the phone calls that you can make to legislators and the information you provide to us. So here are just some quick takeaways for you. If you remember nothing else of what I say here, I'll reference this again throughout the morning, but please, please, please sign up for Friday Facts. If you're not receiving Friday Facts, you're missing out on the regular updates throughout the off season, but during the legislative session, we send Friday Facts every day. So we are sending a daily email with legislative updates. That's how we request information back from you and then keep you informed. So please make sure you sign up for Friday Facts. You can either give me your email address today, or you can just go to the league website, ulct.org, and you can find a link there to sign up for Friday Facts. Second, make sure your city is participating in our Legislative Policy Committee. Every city and town is entitled to participate in the Policy Committee, regardless of your size. If you're not sure if your city's participating, on the league website, you can click on the LPC link and you can see who the roster is, and you can see who from your city is participating therein. The Legislative Policy Committee meets weekly during the legislative session and more or less monthly outside of the session. We'll have our first meeting for the legislative interim a week from Monday on May 20th. And at that point, we plan to outline here are the bills and the issues that are going to consume our attention over the next few months. And that's where we will be soliciting different participants for work groups and sharing what data we need from cities. And we run all that through the large Legislative Policy Committee. So please make sure that you're on Friday Facts and receiving that information. Even if you personally are not a voting member of LPC, you can still participate in LPC. It's open. It's a hybrid meeting. Please join us. Third, we have a legislative wrap-up on our website. QR code's behind me, and you can see in more detail all the bills that Wilf was just describing a moment ago. I'm going to skip to number 5 and come back to 4. We've done a bunch of spring training webinars. So in addition to being in southern Utah basically every week for the last 6 weeks, hitting all the different conferences, we've also done a variety of spring training webinars that are all on the website. In the housing and planning space, we've done some general ones on land use as well as on moderate income housing plans. Okay, so what happened in 2024? Here are the great 8, the key themes that emerged from the session. We already told you it was a record year of legislation. So if you feel like you've got a big workload because of the bills that passed, you're not alone. Basically, everybody who deals with the legislature had a record workload. The second key theme, Wilf touched on it, but the message that we were delivering to legislators over and over and over again this session was twofold: partnership, not preemption, and the state doesn't have a surplus and neither do cities. The legislation we're going to talk about here really fits into that partnership, not preemption space, but it also fits into the state doesn't have a surplus and neither do cities. So, for example, 2 years ago, we actually had a modified theme here. Our theme then was the state has a surplus, but we don't. And that message resonated with legislators because we actually aggregated the potential fiscal impact of a whole bunch of bills, and the aggregate fiscal impact on cities that session was over $110 million of unfunded mandates. Because of that data collection that we provided to legislative leadership in the governor's office, they scaled back almost every one of those bills. Well, this year, we didn't actually even need to build the spreadsheet because the legislature didn't have surplus money. And so when we just told them, like, that's an unfunded mandate on us, you don't have any money, we don't either, they said, yep, you're right, we don't want unfunded mandates. And so that also helped that partnership, not preemption approach, because everybody knew that money was tight. The fourth key theme, and this one, please recognize this theme as we talk about the tools: affordable home ownership and sustainable infrastructure. We said we want to be part of the solution on housing. We've worked on multiple bills over the last few years, whether it was stationary plans or changes to subdivisions, but we made it a point of emphasis that legislation should have a nexus to affordable home ownership and to sustainable infrastructure. And when I say sustainable, I'm not talking about it in the environmental sense, I'm talking about it in the financial sense. Data matters. I referenced this in the general session, that the data that you provided us around SB 185 made a big difference, and the data that we collect in general makes a difference. And in fact, when we talk in a moment about the financing bills that came out of this session, we actually were collecting data during the session, worked with both Lewis Robertson and Birmingham. Jason Birmingham's here in front of us, as well as with Zions Bank Public Finance, trying to gather data about what these bills could mean, so that would inform our policy discussion. The sixth key theme was it was an election year. Maybe you haven't heard, but it is an election year, and the entire House of Representatives is up for re-election, as well as half of the Senate, and so that made a difference. And for better or for worse, this just is what it is. It is a year-round legislative session. And so they pass laws in January and February. They make laws all year round. Wilf referenced the Commission on Housing Affordability. It met on Tuesday this week. We'll have updates about it in more detail on Friday Facts. We've already got some work groups underway on some different topics at the Capitol. The legislative interim meetings start next Wednesday. I was at the Capitol most of the day, Monday and Tuesday of this week. So it's a year-round session. So if you wait to call us until January, frankly, it's too late. It's helpful, but it's too late. So another just ask we have in general is, if there are issues within LUDMA or within other pieces of the code that you would like to see fixed, let us know. Over the last few weeks, we have been gathering that sort of feedback from your attorneys. I was with the attorneys yesterday. I am one too, so I got my CLEs at the same time, so that was nice. But the attorneys are meeting right now, the treasurers are meeting, so making the same pitch to them as well as to our elected officials as we're trying to build out the list of problems to potentially address, because bill files are already getting open. And then the last theme, questions about state and local authority. And again, this tension is not new. It's happening all over the country. I feel really good about generally how we've handled it here in Utah. We'll touch briefly on the hockey and the Fair Park issues. The one thing that I'll reference on the Fair Park piece, and then we'll move on to the other tools here, is we're seeing a growing trend of the state stepping in and utilizing municipal authority or exercising municipal functions. And there's been litigation about that in the past around the inland port, and that's something we are very conscientious of in trying to figure out the best path forward to address that tension. Okay. This slide basically tells you everything you need to know. Not really. We'll go into a lot more detail here in a second, but we're prepared to have a back and forth with you about which bills you want a deeper dive on. So the ones on the left that you can't actually read because of the color, those are the bills that are in the housing space. Wilf touched on all of them, but we're prepared to do a little deeper dive on them. This partnership, not preemption equation really is focused on the key builds around new housing product, financing tools, and process updates. Here is my plea to you. If your city gets asked for one of the new financing tools, please let us know. We want to know how that goes. These are all discretionary tools, okay? You're not required to say yes. The minute somebody says no, I could see the story emerging at the Capitol that Wilf City said no. Normally it's Cameron City, so I'm picking on Wilf City this time. Wilf City said no, so therefore cities aren't being good actors, and we need to step in and take away land use authority. Whereas in actuality, Wilf City may have said no because the financing tools don't actually pay for the infrastructure that Wilf City needs, and so they need to look at different tools. So we want to know that detail, but we also want to be able to say Wilf City may have said no, but Jason City, Cameron City, and Scott City all said yes, and here are these projects underway. And even though the bills went into effect 9 days ago, we've got our first project that I'm aware of that's already moving forward and being financed through House Bill 572. And it was in a public meeting just this past Monday. And then I know there's already been some chatter in the development community as they're looking to retool some projects. Out of curiosity, how many of you have had somebody approach you since the session about infrastructure financing districts, House Bill 13, House Bill 572 financing, a FIZ, a HOPS, or an HDRZ? 1, 2, okay. 2, which one was it? Which tool have they asked you about? Those of you raise your hands. Which tools have they asked you about?
Public infrastructure, it was Morgan County.
Morgan County? Okay. Okay. Well, I expect you're going to get more and more questions. So hopefully you'll feel better prepared after the next hour and a half. And then just know we're going to have white papers, hopefully in Friday Facts today, if not today, next week. That'll go into more detail about these. Here are the intended purpose of these tools. And in a moment, I'm going to have Amro come up to talk through the modular housing piece, and then I'll come back and do the financing tools. But here's the quick nutshell, really what's contemplated for these tools. So if you think about infill development, transit-adjacent development, greenfield development, and redevelopment, infrastructure needs are different in all of those different types of areas. So with infrastructure financing districts, House Bill 13, conceivably, you could have a developer who could utilize an HB 13 financing district for any of these types of spaces. So I'm starting on the one where there's the 4 checks and then working backwards. The homeownership promotion zone, this is SB 168. There's a limit of 10 acres for the use of this tool. So that's likely going to be infill development or like small scale green development. With the FIZ 268, it's probably could be used anywhere, probably not in transit because it's more of the HDRZ tool. HDRZ is for transit. And then 572 is probably greenfield. But the bigger point here is that these tools can be used in a variety of different ways, and you may even be able to use different tools. You may get 572 funding and the tax increment funding. So as we go into the deeper dive here in a second, what we hope for is a back and forth discussion where you ask us questions about how those tools are going to work. So I mentioned in the equation that we had modular housing plus process updates plus financing. So we're going to go in that sequence. So I'm going to turn the time over to Amro for a moment to start talking, take about 15 minutes to just do the overview on modular and then see what questions people have about modular, recognizing that the reason, as Wilf said, all the parties were able to get to yes in the modular space was because we've seen some evidence around the country of where the development community and communities have been able to work together to facilitate modular housing. You've actually seen a significant decrease in construction costs. And in Utah, modular technology is relatively new, but what's exciting is Amro's involved with a project right now on the ground in Salt Lake County, and we thought it'd be helpful for you to see, how is this actually going to work as this new law is in effect. So Amro, I'll turn it over to you, and then I'll come back to talk financing. And your clicker, not sure if that's the clicker or not, but I've just been advancing it. Okay, perfect.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Amro, and I work as a development manager with Ivory Innovations, a nonprofit organization in Salt Lake County. We also develop affordable housing projects. I want to start this discussion or this conversation by asking the question, why do we need to change why do we need the change in construction? Well, the graph on the screen that you can see shows the productivity in different sectors here in the US. And if you notice, the construction productivity was in 2010 similar to what it was in 1947, while other sectors' productivity has grown exponentially in the last few decades. If you look at agriculture, it's 1,600. Manufacturing, more than 800 times, so 8 times more productive than what it was in 1947. And the answer to that is we need to create some changes in the construction methods and processes that we currently have if we want to achieve more affordable housing, which is a pressing issue here in the US right now. And I'm here to talk about the modular construction specifically. It is just one of these approaches and new technologies and methods that we are trying to introduce here in the construction industry to make sure that we can build more houses more efficiently and with a reduced cost, so we can help solve the housing affordability issue. So I just want to start with talking about what is modular construction, or the general term, the larger term is off-site construction. Well, modular construction is just a process. It's not a new building type. And it is building these buildings or constructing these buildings in an off-site controlled facilities using the same materials that we use to build our homes right now in a traditional way. And the most important thing, these buildings are designed to the same codes and standards as these traditional buildings. So any modular building that will be built here in Utah, for example, in Salt Lake City, in Cedar City, St. George, it will meet all the code requirements in that city and that local jurisdiction. And off-site construction is divided into two main construction methods, basically. And it depends on how much of the construction you're doing off-site and how much you're doing on-site. The modular, the volumetric modular, it basically creates an entire module, which could be one unit, which could be part of the unit, or it could be 2 units that are attached to each other. It's fully finished from the inside, drywall, paint, electrical cabinet, flooring, all of it, shipped to the site and then installed one next to each other to form the building. The other type, which gives flexibility to the on-site and more efficiency to the on-site construction, but you create some of these items and construction items in a factory, which is called panelized or kit of switch. Which basically says that you build these wall panels, floor panels that is ready, and the level of finishing differs here between one manufacturing facility and the other. For example, you could ship panels that are ready with drywall and some plumbing, and you just need to connect it on site. Sometimes you just ship the framing with the shear walls ready, and for example, pre-bat insulation. So you can you can do more inspections and you have more control on site. So now I'm going to switch. What are the benefits of using modular? Obviously, we're introducing this. We're trying to work with this new technology because we see some benefits there. And some of these most important benefits are speed. Using modular construction or off-site construction, you can expedite the timeline of a project by almost cutting it into half, because you're doing the on-site building, the podium, the infrastructure for the project, while you're manufacturing the modules off-site, shipping them, and the installation is basically cutting the time in half for that process when it comes to the finishing and building the framing on site. The second one is cost. Basically, when when you work on a modular construction project, the financing cost drops significantly because modular construction is very efficient. They're using the same technologies used in the manufacturing, which was introduced around 100 years ago. So using these methodologies will expedite the construction. The project that I will be talking about in a few minutes, it contains around 165 modules. And it will be, these 165 modules will be built in 5 to 6 weeks and shipped to the project site. There is still some works that needs to be done on site, such as some exterior finishings, utility connections, some fire testing, MEP testing, all of that, the installation of these modules. But even with doing all of that on site, you still can cut the construction time by half. Quality. Quality is a huge topic here. In a manufacturing facility, you're using automation programs that is very precise. So the quality, it's a more controlled environment. So the quality of these modules actually exceeds any on-site construction project that I have seen personally. And I've visited construction sites, I know construction sites, and I've visited a few manufacturing facilities. It's exceptional, the quality that these manufacturing facilities could produce. Safety, workers don't have to work under the elements. If it's windy, if it's raining or snowing, workers in the manufacturing facility, they're basically working in a factory. So they don't have to deal with all of these elements that could be a hazard, and they're using more machines to help them lift trusses, lift beams, and work with these machines to expedite the work. Reduced waste, using machines, it's precise, you get the materials cut to size, you don't waste a lot, you use the wasted material in other portions, and that's why modular construction is one of the new technologies that could help our housing affordability issue. So now I'm just going to start talking about some of these differences when we're going to work on projects, on off-site construction projects. There are a few differences in the planning before starting the construction, and I will touch base on a few of these. One of them is design. In a traditionally built building, basically the developer will go to the architect, they will talk to them about this piece of land, what can we do? The architect will start by drawing the outline of the building, the outline of each floor, and then they will start cut and divide these floor plans to create each unit, which isn't efficient because at the end of the day, each unit could be slightly different or different than the other, which creates problem in productivity and speed in construction. In off-site construction, the design starts with the units, with the buildings, with the modules. They optimize the design of these modules, the units, they figure out the sustainability factor, quality factor, size, living experience. They optimize these units and they start replicating these units to create the building. So the building starts with the smaller unit, with the units inside it, and then you create the larger footprint, not the other way around. So you basically prioritize the living experience of the tenants instead of prioritizing the building footprint. You design for the tenants first, and then you come up with the building footprint. Engineering. Engineering on a traditionally constructed building, you usually go hire a consultant, structural engineer, MEP engineers to figure out the MEP work and fire work in a building. In an off-site construction, it could be a little bit different, and this depends on who the developer is using for these work, basically. So, for example, some manufacturing facilities, they take ownership of all of the MEP, fire, and structural engineering for the entire building, including the on-site portion, which is the concrete podium, the infrastructure, utility connections. Some of them will just take ownership of the modular portion of the project, and you still have to coordinate between your on-site consultants and engineers and your off-site modular engineers. And it differs. There are multiple manufacturing facilities that they do it. They take ownership of all of it. Sometimes some of them they take ownership on only the manufactured part of the project. The third and last thing that I want to talk about here in the differences is transportation, staging, and installation. Basically, when it comes to off-site construction, transportation is a huge deal and it needs to be sorted out and figured out prior to even designing and building these units in a factory. Because some of these units can span up to 74 feet and 16 feet in width. So special permits will be needed, for example, and there are some constraints with bridges, with turns, so all of this needs to be figured out even before finalizing the design, in the very early stages of design. These things needs to be finalized because it will affect the delivery and the efficiency of the modular project. Staging and installation, basically staging these modules come weather wrapped to the project, so not a lot of protection is needed on site. They're already protected. Once they reach out to the site, you'll just remove the weather wrapping, install them, and continue working. When it comes to on-site, you need a larger staging area, and it's protected just to protect these materials from the elements, which could add up to the construction cost of the project. Installation, basically the installation of these modules take days. It's just a crane moving these modules, anchoring them with anchor bolts, depending on the structural engineer recommendations and details, structural details. The installation of an on-site construction, it's 2x4s, 2x6, top plate, bottom plate, all of that. So it's less time consuming. Now I want to switch to the project that we're working on, and we're exploring the modular methodology of construction in this project. This project is based in Draper City along Vista Station Boulevard in Salt Lake County. It will include 186 units, and as I mentioned, 165 modules plus a podium. We started talking with the city about this earlier. They were very open. They want to help us understand the processes, and now we're working with the manufacturing facilities, trying to figure out the best way on doing that. In the meantime, the state has passed the legislative about the modular code, which will help us in the permitting, which will help basically in the permitting and review processes. So this is the piece of land that we're working on. It's a little bit bigger than 5 acres. It will include 186 units. It's a high-density area near a creek. We're actually working on the creek right now to make it safer and accessible as an amenity, outside amenity for this project. And this is just a schematic site plan that shows that the project includes 3 buildings, 3 separate buildings, and a plaza with a podium underneath that. And with these pictures, 3D images of these projects, I want to show that modular construction, it's not just about taking one unit and repeating it over and over and over again, so you end up with a boring facade, a boring building facade or elevation. This is actually can be achieved in modular construction. It's just creating 3 or 4 different sizes of modules and then arranging them. It could be up to 5, 6, 7, how many modules. The less the better, because the efficiency in the manufacturing facility will increase, the efficiency in the construction will increase, but these elevations could be achieved even in modular construction. This is just the podium level plan for the project. We're including around 224 parking spaces. We still need to figure out a few additional parking spaces to meet the parking code requirements. But the podium will be an on-site construction. It will be concrete on-site. While we're doing this, the manufacturing facility that we are going to work with will be working on the modules, getting them ready and shipped to the site. So once the podium is ready, we can start just installing these modules. I didn't want to share the entire project plans because it's multiple plans. I just wanted to share one of these plans and the second floor specifically. And this is the modular analysis, and it basically shows each color is a different module type. It doesn't have to be a different size, but it's a different type based on the location, which sides needs to be finished, which sides needs to be needs to remain the same so you can attach the next module to it. And between this modular analysis and this is the unit layout, you can see on, I don't know if there is a pointer in here. Yep. You can see that these modules over here, there are 4 different modules. But if we go to the next slide, you'll see that these 2 modules are just one 2-bedroom unit, and these 2 modules are just one 2-bedroom unit. The same over here. These modules are just one module each, and they are studio units. And then we go to the last one. These 2 modules combined, they will create a 2-bedroom unit. So basically, a module is not a living unit. A module could be half a living unit. It could be multiple living units, as I will show in the next few slides. This is just an example about what can be done with these modules. For example, here is a 1-bedroom, and this one is 30 feet by 25 feet wide, and it's a 1-bedroom. So this is the first module over here, which includes the living area, kitchen. This is what's called the mate wall, where the 2 modules are connected, and this is the second module where we have the bedroom, the walk-in closet, and the toilet. The most important things in the design is that you don't want to, for spaces to be in 2 modules, like the living space in one module, the bedroom is in one module and doesn't go through multiple modules, which will create more efficiencies in the project. This is the same module, same sizes, but it's a 2-bedroom apartment. And this is different sizes, but it's also a 2-bedroom apartment. So these modules in the interior, you can change them as much as you want. You can play with them to create the product that, the home that you want. And this is the last slide, and we've been talking with a different manufacturer recently about that is closer to Utah to cut some of the transportation construction cost. And if you can see here, this is just a red line drawing, so it's not very accurate, but basically this was the length and width of the unit from the previous manufacturing facility. This new manufacturing facility can produce on a larger scale just because in the factory they have the capacity to go larger modules. So the modules that we're talking about right now is 12 feet wide and 74 feet in length instead of 30 or 36 feet in length. So that will cut some of the transportation cost just because you have less trips between the manufacturing facility and the site. And as you can see here, there are some problems that we face that we need to work on. For example, here they want to do this as one module, but the current design extends past 74. It's actually 78 feet in length. So we need to work on the design a little bit to make sure that it fits within the manufacturing limitations of this manufacturing facility. And with this slide, I will end my presentation. And yeah, so if you have any questions, please let me know. I'm happy to answer anything I can.
Sorry, big room.
I have 2 questions. One is kind of explain the difference, if you could, between what we've known as manufactured homes and these new modular homes that are being regulated by the state. And then is there anything in the new legislation that helps those cost savings end up getting to the buyer and not by the developer?
So I will start with the first question. So basically the manufactured homes that we know right now, it's all built in manufacturing facilities to the standard that HUD set back in the 1970s. But the off-site construction that we're talking about now will be built, each building will be unique, and it will meet the standards and the specifications and codes for the localities that this building will be installed in. So there is a huge difference when it comes to code. That's a federal code. HUD introduced that back a few decades ago. The modular work that we're talking about is basically will meet all the standards and codes for each locality. When it comes to the cost savings, Ivory Innovations is a nonprofit organization, so basically we're developing this project, experimenting and working with modular manufacturers here, and these units will be affordable housing. We're required by the IRS safe harbor rules to have a certain housing affordability requirements. 75% of the units will be rented at 80% AMI or less. But in a general view, if a commercial modular contractor would use modular to construct their units and their homes, basically reducing the timeline will create more product in the market, which will help stabilize or reduce the purchasing prices of these homes. Cutting costs, obviously, if the developer cost is reduced, it will be more competitive with others, so they will reduce their their selling price. So all of these could help with solving the housing affordability issue.
I looked into constructing a home about 10, 12 years ago, and I compared stick-built construction with modular. There is a manufacturer in Spanish Fork. You may have talked with them as part of this project, I'm not sure. But at that time, there virtually wasn't any saving, at least not for a sort of medium-sized residential home.
So when it comes to, and modular construction is all about repetition and efficiency in construction. If you're building only one unit, it has to be designed separately, and then they're going to build it in a factory. The factories itself, running a factory itself, is a little bit expensive, but because of the speed and being able to produce multiple units in a day, that will reduce the construction cost. So modular construction might not work if you want to build just one single family home, but if you want to build a subdivision and you have 10 or 15 designs that you're repeating here and there, this could be a great solution because it's the same design. If you want to build a multifamily project like this one over here, this could be a great solution because you're just repeating these modules and changing some of the interior finishes and some of the interior dividers and walls. And that's what creates the efficiency in modular construction and create the opportunity to cut cost in construction.
It seems like recently there's been some more discussion about condominiumization and trying to create ownership opportunities on a smaller scale. Has there been any discussion on using these off-site manufactured product to also condominiumize and allow for some ownership opportunities versus rental opportunities?
I'm not sure of any of these conversations. I don't know, Cameron, if you can talk about this, but no, I'm not sure of any of these conversations. I haven't been involved in any of these.
I'm glad you brought that up, though, because one of the vexing problems we've had right now has been when you're seeing more and more mixed-use development, you're seeing more and more multifamily product coming online. They're almost entirely rental properties. So how do we crack the code around owner-occupied and condos? The Commission on Housing Affordability met 3 days ago, as Wilf and I referenced, and one of the items prioritized on Tuesday, it was actually an item that we've been pushing for a while, has been how do we help facilitate more owner occupancy in built-out established communities and in the infill type product. I was with Steve Waldrop last night. I know he spoke to this group yesterday, and I was with him last night, and we were again going back and forth on how do we crack the code on this condo piece. So those conversations are happening. With respect to the modular technology, we've really focused more on the regulatory side to facilitate more modular construction and utilization in Utah. It's been separate from these other conversations happening around condos and owner occupancy. And to the question that you asked a moment ago about the price difference between the two, several months ago, we were doing some research nationally as a league to just figure out what is the impact. If we go down this path of changing the regulatory structure, and that's what we did. We acknowledged that we as local governments would be essentially walking away from some local government authority because right now prior to this bill, modular could have happened. It just would have been, all the inspections would have happened locally, or you would have had a local inspector going to a factory. We got to a point we were comfortable with this new process in SB 168 because we saw data from around the country of where they are doing modular construction at scale that it really has brought down construction costs. And that key term is at scale, as Amro was referencing. And right now, we're not really at scale. We have the manufacturer in Spanish Fork, and they were part of the creation of this bill, and there are a couple other manufacturers. But we are anticipating, now that this bill is in law, that the Governor's Office of Economic Opportunity is going to be aggressive in this space in trying to facilitate the expansion of modular housing manufacturing in Utah to get to this scale point so that then it can bring down the construction costs. And then there'll be these ongoing conversations around condos and owner occupancy.
Sir, I think you wanted to ask a question.
I can just speak loud. The question I mainly have is just a thought here. Why stop at the housing portion as far as modularizing? Any plans or any thoughts about modularizing the parking? Maybe it can integrate with the homes?
So the question was, why stop at just the structure? What about parking or integration or other things? Just so everyone in the back can hear.
Well, I don't think that's a limitation. Like, you can use modular when you see the efficiency. For example, in parking underneath, it could be used, but the problem that we start facing is, okay, what about the car loads? What about the shear force and all of that? So if it is solved from a structural point of view, using materials, whether it's steel beams or wood or concrete, maybe it could be modularized and then used. But it depends on whether it would be efficient to do it in a modular way at the moment or not. That's the question that we need to talk about and discuss to make sure that it's more efficient to do it off-site than on-site, so let's do it off-site. Maybe right now it's on-site because all of the manufacturing facilities that we've been talking to, the podium, the parking podium is an on-site portion of the project with all of the manufacturing facility that we've talked to and I'm aware of here in the U.S.
Simple question. What savings did you realize or anticipating to realize on this project by doing modular versus traditional on-site?
So we're actually still working on the budget right now, but we think it might, as a cost, like out-of-pocket cost, it could be very comparable, maybe slightly a little bit more expensive than traditional construction, but you end up saving a lot of time, and that saves a lot of interest reserve in these projects. So we're still developing the budget here on this project just because we have an estimate from the manufacturing facility, but there are multiple exclusions in this project, such as like the fire system that needs to be installed in on-site outside of these units. So we're trying right now to figure out the cost of these items to come up with a general understanding of exactly how much it's going to cost to build this project and start comparing it. But for now, from a 30,000 level look, it seems it will be comparable to a traditionally built building.
And will you post the results of this project at some point with conclusions once you get through it for others to look at?
This is a decision that I cannot make, but I'm happy to check.
All right, it is 10:20, so we will continue on with our deep dive here. For those who may have just walked in, this is the housing equation, housing policy equation from the 2024 legislative session. New housing product plus financing tools plus process updates equals partnership, not preemption. And for anybody who is new to the session now, if you could ask for any of the financing tools, please let the league know. We want to know how that experience is going. The first portion of the presentation here focused on piece one, new housing product, modular housing. So if you just walked in and you have questions about modular housing, just come up to us afterward and we can walk you through that. And again, this particular session is being recorded, so you can watch the modular housing presentation after. And thanks to Amro from Ivory Innovations for doing that presentation. Now we're going to pivot to the new financing tools, and there are several of them. What we hope to accomplish over the next little bit is to answer whatever questions you may have about how these tools could work in practice, because these tools are new. They are based on some existing tools, but there are some key distinctions with existing tools, and some of them are really unique that we've never really seen utilized around the country before either. So there are going to be some growing pains with each of them. They've really fit into three buckets. Bucket number one is letter A, bucket number two is letter B, and bucket number three is letters C, D, and E. Bucket A is the infrastructure financing districts. Bucket B is not actually focused on infrastructure, but is a way to finance the construction of affordable home ownership units. And then bucket number three is tax increment financing, but with a focus on housing in a variety of those ways. So, what I plan to do here is to start walking through the tools. That said, we have time for back and forth. So if you have questions, don't wait till the end. Just raise your hands, Meg will find you, and we'll ask questions. We'll start with letter A, and if I can't answer it, then hopefully Jason can, as we proceed here. So we will, and then I should also note, we have slides about some of the other land use bills like House Bill 476 and House Bill 289 that Wilf went over this morning. So if you want a deeper dive on any of those, we'll be ready for that too. So let's start first with House Bill.
And Cam, those are all on our website as well.
That is
if
true.
you want to access those under events.
Yep, you got it. Thank you, Meg. So House Bill 13, I mentioned there are three categories. House Bill 13 is in the infrastructure financing district. I wish it had a catchy acronym like the other ones. It doesn't. It's just it's infrastructure financing districts. How many of you are familiar with PIDs, public infrastructure districts? Okay, perfect. This would be like a second cousin of PIDs. They're in the family. There's some genetic similarities, but there are some key differences. Okay. Now, I mentioned it before when I was talking about the overall themes of the session about affordable home ownership. When I get to the next two buckets have guarantees related to them and requirements related to them around affordable home ownership. What Amro was just discussing on modular housing is really more general around housing, and infrastructure financing districts are more general around housing. So modular nor infrastructure financing districts have direct requirements around affordable home ownership like the other tools do. Instead, what House Bill 13 is trying to accomplish is another tool to finance large-scale infrastructure, similar to a public infrastructure district, but with some key differences. Point number one about House Bill 13 districts. They are created by the property owners subsequent to receiving the land use approval by the city or county. Now, this is critical because in a moment I'm going to talk about how it varies from a PID, but that process is similar to a PID. The local government approves the project. In the case of a PID, the local government approves the PID as well. In this case, the local government just approves the project. They give that land use approval, And then after that, and the property owners agree with the consent of 100% of them to do it, once they have that land use approval from the city, those property owners with 100% consent can create their own district without needing the city's approval. Now, at first blush, that may seem concerning. And frankly, at first blush, it was concerning to us when we started these conversations on this bill almost 2 years ago. We got to a point where we were less concerned for the reasons that I'll explain here in a moment. So they think through a process. The city does the land use approval, then the property owner creates the infrastructure financing district. So why would they do it? Well, they'll do it because by creating that public entity, they would then be eligible to access the public bond markets and access less expensive capital to finance the necessary infrastructure. So that's the appeal to them. But the difference between the IFTA and the PID is with the IFTA that the city is not backing it. So the city does not have any sort of financial risk with the IFTA. Again, wish there was a better acronym, but with the Infrastructure Financing District. So that district, if you're that property owner, you're going to say, well, if I go the PID route and have the city approval on the PID route, I'm probably actually going to get a better rate. But if I don't want to go the city route, or the city maybe isn't willing to go the PID route, here's this other tool to go the Infrastructure Financing District. Still likely to be a better rate than you would get with commercial financing, but not as good of a rate as you would get likely through a public infrastructure district. Now, they are authorized to impose, like a PID, they're authorized to impose a property tax mill levy, a very, 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 very minor one. But they are not allowed, and this is a key safeguard, which is why we as a league got comfortable with it, they are not allowed to use this property tax revenue to pay off the bond. So they would issue essentially the assessment area bond, and instead they have to pay off that bond when they sell the individual parcel to that future homeowner. So now that future homeowner does not have the infrastructure financing district debt obligation on their property once they've purchased it. So think about it this way. Let's say you have a subdivision with 1,000 units, and I come in to purchase the unit, and the infrastructure has been financed for all 1,000 units from the infrastructure financing district. When I purchase my property, my 1/1000th of that property, the portion of the debt related to my property is extinguished because it's paid off as part of the sale. So it still is on the other 999 until they are sold off. But me as a property owner, a new homeowner, I am not paying an additional property tax that I don't know about to pay off that bond going forward, because the bond is paid off at the time of conveyance. So when you think from a local government perspective, there are these key safeguards in place. One, we still have to approve the project up front. Two, the future home buyer does not have that debt on that property going forward. And then three, the infrastructure has to be built to the local government standards. Okay, let me pause there about House Bill 13. And then you can see timing-wise, assessment has to be paid prior to C of O issuance. Property tax not used to repay the bonds, as I said, and then districts must dissolve within 180 days of the entire debt being repaid. Yeah, is that you, Dennis? I can't actually see. Okay.
Is there a provision to adjust the property tax once a year when that gets paid off, or do we just have to be sensitive to the timing of when those
So, Dennis, make sure I heard the question correctly, because I think I only caught about half of it. Meg, can you just take it back, because I didn't catch enough of it, so I don't want to repeat it if I'm totally wrong.
Yep.
Thanks.
So they pay that off, they no longer have that tax mill levy on their property, but at what point does that get adjusted off? Just the once a year like everybody else? Or is there provision that once that's paid, the assessor knows that they have to adjust that mill rate off?
Jason, do you know the answer to that on the timing? Yeah, coming up. So I'll invite Jason Birmingham from Lewis Birmingham and Robertson. The new title keeps getting me because I know I have to skip a word from historically. I'll let Jason give the answer to that question.
Yeah, let me just quickly address, I think the concept, which includes both a tax levy, which is an operation and maintenance tax levy that could be authorized under the Infrastructure Finance District. And so that could potentially go in tandem with the length of the bond issue that's outstanding. I guess it could also potentially go beyond that. In terms of the assessment, what Cam has described is the assessment then gets paid off. So it's not a tax levy or a specific tax rate that's applied to property tax, but it's a special assessment that would be imposed by the Infrastructure Finance District. So that district would be the one that would release that from the title of the property. So it would no longer have an assessment on it. It would be free and clear from that assessment. Now the O&M mill levy, this 4 mills, may continue beyond that to take care of operation and maintenance of that infrastructure that's put in place. Does that answer that question?
We also note that the mill levy can't be increased.
Yes, and so the tax rate itself cannot be increased, so it's limited to no greater than those 4 mills. I would also say the same thing on the assessment. So when the assessment is created, originally created, put in place, bonds issued, that assessment is determined at that time, and it would be a fixed assessment that would be payable, in this case, over the life of potentially the bond issue, with the caveat that there would be an early call feature that would require that when the property changes from ownership of the builder developer to the homeowner, that at that point in time the assessment would have to be paid before a certificate of occupancy could be delivered to the new homeowner. And then that assessment amount couldn't change and couldn't be increased. Got a question right here.
Yeah, we got one here first, then. Yep, go ahead.
Is this like the PID in that all the infrastructure that's constructed with these funds does have to get dedicated to the city? They can't use this for their private stuff?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct, and it would be very specific to public infrastructure owned by either, I guess, the public entity, local entity. It could be the city, could be the county, could be a special district. It could even potentially be the Infrastructure Finance District, but it would have to be public infrastructure as defined in the statute.
If 100% of the surface property owners have to create the IFD and it's owned by the developer and it's sold piece by piece, how is that created? The developer can create it? Okay.
Yep.
And that really is probably the likely intent of more of a master planned or organized residential project where a developer does maybe assembles and acquires all of the land rights. And then the idea of like a PID, they would approach the local government and say, well, we'd like to finance the public infrastructure. This is a better tool in terms of a lower cost financing. As Cam did very well, there is a difference though. The PID does have additional, what I would say, oversight initially from the local jurisdiction that would sponsor a PID, meaning that a governing document would be created and the city and or county would have the opportunity to maybe dismiss or not create a PID or a PID. The Infrastructure Financing District is a little different in that it does allow for it to move forward even without maybe the local jurisdiction's consent or willingness to do it. It kind of promulgates it that it moves forward. However, there were several, what I would call several belts and suspenders that were put on this as part of the legislative process to say we realize that cities won't necessarily be able to govern it, whether or not it can be used, but we certainly want to govern the possibility where we've had difficulties in assessments going on, 20 or 30 years, property owners changing hands, coming in, not realizing that they have an assessment, not understanding what's on the title. All of those issues that have come up in the past on assessments, we've tried to really modify that so it's very specific to really construction financing. That's really what this is, construction financing for public infrastructure. Then once it gets taken out or goes to the homeowner, in essence, it's being taken out, if you will, by the mortgage.
You have a question?
My question was similar to this last one, but I guess more of a curiosity where this is somewhat done outside of the city's purview, but it's still dedicated to the city. Its public infrastructure has to meet the city's design standards for all that infrastructure improvement. And there's a board that can impose a mill levy. Is it ever anticipated that this board might be the city council or the county commission, or what long term is it? Would it be dissolved and just taken over by the city? I'm just kind of curious how long term these things will evolve, and if it stays separate under a separate board, or if it just is intended to come into the city at some point.
Yeah, excellent questions, and this was actually part of the back and forth we had. I mentioned that this was actually a 2-year effort as we were working through this concept. That was one of the questions: is at some point should the IFTA district get brought into the city? And at one point, actually, the bill sponsor offered to require a city council member to be on the infrastructure financing district board. When we actually took that back to the mayors and council members that represent our board of directors, as well as our work group that we had working on this for a couple of years, the answer back was a resounding no, that if this is separate from the city, we want it to be separate from the city. Now, the district does have to dissolve once it's paid back. So once that bond is done, the district dissolves and that governing board goes away. But you will have, for the period of time that the bond is there, you'll have that governing board. And there is the flexibility that if in North Logan, Mayor Peterson and the council wanted to have, or wanted to work with the developer on the infrastructure financing district, you could do that. You're just not required to do that, and the developer doesn't have to say yes either. So you really, when you think about the toolkit that you have now, you've got the public infrastructure district, you've got the infrastructure financing district. This gives a developer more autonomy, but the infrastructure has to meet our standards. They have to have the land use approval. It gets deeded back to us, and then they're responsible for whatever happens with default, and then they can't raise the property tax mill levy beyond what's set out in statute, and it all dissolves once it goes away, and the home buyer's not stuck with it when they buy it. So Jason referred to as belt and suspenders, but those are the guardrails that came out of really almost 2 years of negotiations.
I was just going to say there's also another overriding element of this, and it related to the public infrastructure districts just as much as the IFDs, which is the bond market. And from a legal analysis perspective, we created these to be sovereign, meaning we created them so that they would be independent from the municipality, so that it would not impact any local government's credit rating or bind them through moral obligation, legal obligation, financial obligation. As soon as some of the discussions became of, well, let's appoint members of the board to be elected officials, et cetera, then that nexus between, well, is it really a separate entity or is it really controlled still by the city came up. And the legal analysis was, well, bondholders could pierce that and say, well, we know that you may be defaulted infrastructure district, but we're going to go look back to the government entity that, at least participated or allowed it to be formed. So I think there's a real protection mechanism with the IFDs and the PIFs, or PIDs in particular, because we made sure that there was no moral obligation, legal obligation, financial obligation that any city or county would have, completely independent. Now, you own the infrastructure, you would own it, but you would have no recourse against your general taxing powers, even your ability to go to the bond market would not be impaired. But I think it could if, there were more board members maybe that were city council members, then you have that question of, well, are you really just a backstop to support that? And bondholders, could potentially go after that.
Any other questions about infrastructure financing districts from House Bill 13? Yep.
Sorry, you might have already answered the question. I came in a little late. Land use approval, is that just subdivision approval?
It's the whole kit and caboodle. So this bill does not impact any of your land use authority. So whether it's general plan, zoning, subdivision approval, all of those steps have to be completed in order to proceed with
Construction drawings, all that, okay.
Construction drawings, not
That's
quite
part of the
there.
subdivision process, right?
Yeah, so how do you want to answer that one? Because it's, the intent was, once the city has granted the approval, once you've made your legislative regulation and the zoning's in place, but I guess there's the question about at what point in the administrative process it would.
I would still
kick
think
in.
that you'd have some oversight
Yeah.
from the city of that perspective.
So let me double check. Like the intent was always to say land use approval, all of it is done, all the legislative approval is done, administrative approval is done. But as you're asking that question, I'm thinking through it now. Sometimes I need to double check. So I'll double check that. I'll make a note of it right now, actually, for our white paper to make sure we're clear on that piece.
Yeah, you'll get a lot of landowners, developers speculating on whether or not they can afford to even ask for a rezone. And so if we're telling them they've got to go through the entire entitlement process first, curious how often it's going to get used.
Okay.
The other question I have is, are we concerned about, what my understanding is, the mortgage, the first mortgage or the new mortgage that picks up the property after the developer will pay the assessment? Is that what I heard you say? Okay. Any concerns we're potentially just passing on and deferring construction costs onto the homeowner? And how does that play into housing affordability? It just seems like we're just increasing developers' margins instead.
I'd be happy to address that just quickly. I think that's a very good observation. The capital markets, however, how these public infrastructure, major components of public infrastructure, what I would consider system improvements that are outside of just the project improvements related to the subdivision or the master plan. What we've seen is traditionally the capital markets and how the capital stack has worked for the developer has been equity financing or other traditional debt forms of financing, commercial loans, et cetera. So even though we would be still having to cover the cost of public infrastructure, the cost through a tax-exempt IFD would still be marginally lower than what the commercial financing would be for the developer. Unlike some of the other tools where there are some specific guidelines where affordability is measured and absolute, this one is more of a factor of, okay, will it get passed on, will it not? But presumably, like modular homes even, if you can reduce the cost of the financing to the developer, then hopefully that's passed on in the price of the home, and then the mortgage is related to that. So, we averaged probably a 2% spread during the construction period. Let's say it's 2 or 3 years. So, on a $500,000 home, maybe it is, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 of savings, just an interest cost that the developer wouldn't have to cover, that this tax-exempt tool would cover. So it really is more of a short-term financing, construction cost mechanism that we hope translates into benefit to home ownership and home affordability.
But I'm glad you asked that question, because in the work group that we had for the last couple of years, we were asking that question too. And even though Jason's spot on, those requirements aren't in here, just like they're not in the modular housing bill, that dialogue carried over into these other tools we're about to talk about. And I should have noted this actually at the beginning here, but we did a survey this point now, maybe 9 months ago, is when we started it, and then we finished it in November, where we reached out to cities all over the state, and we had 66 cities respond to our data request because we wanted to know how many housing units are out there that are zoned and entitled, but for which building permits have not yet been pulled. Because the narrative at the Capitol had been cities are not planning for housing and they're interfering with housing development. And so you heard Wilf talk about the zoning reform, and you have seen in other states where cities are just flat out saying no to housing projects. And we were arguing we're different. We have many cities around the state that are planning for a large number of housing projects. They're just stuck. And why are they stuck? Well, they're stuck for market forces outside of our control, whether that's land costs, labor costs, material shortages, inflation, interest rates, infrastructure shortcomings. But there are a lot of market forces that are outside of our control. So actually what I would say rekindled interest in what became House Bill 13 was Representative Jim Dunnigan, who's a former city council member, saying to us, I hear you loud and clear that there are these housing units that cities have planned for and zoned for, but are stuck right now. And our aggregate number from those 66 cities was 190,000 housing units. So we were able to, we broke that down by city. I can tell you in Saratoga Springs, it was almost 30,000. In West Jordan, it was 9,000. In Lehigh, it was 8,300. And these were housing units that we planned for, but are stuck. So Representative Dunnigan said, okay, how do we unstick these? How do we unlock these housing units? And so then when we said, well, we want to have some nexus to affordability or home ownership, he said, well, my objective is just to unlock these units you guys have already planned for. And House Bill 13, the final version of it, we think could do that in addition to helping with new housing units that have not yet been entitled and have not yet been planned for. So with that being said, before I pivot to the next bill, any other question about House Bill 13 infrastructure districts? Go ahead.
It's a 30-year.
Oh, no, yeah, go ahead.
One of the major changes that was previously assessment, the Assessment Area Act allowed for 20-year installments, if you will, or 20-year amortizations for debt service related to special assessments. Infrastructure financing districts expanded that so that it's 30 years, so it's more common to go along with a mortgage. Now, with that said, 30-year amortization, but most of these, when they're sold to the homeowner, obviously are going to be captured in that mortgage and paid off at that time.
Okay. Jason, thank you very much, and feel free to keep joining me up here as we talk through some of these other tools.
So Cameron, I'm going to make a suggestion. You are my boss, so you don't have to accept this. But we yesterday at the keynote, we talked about this a lot with Steve Waldrop, and I'm thinking we want to get to the other ones, which really are ones we want to understand, the hop and the fizz. This one, I think maybe if there are other questions, now would be the time, because I think we all understood what he said yesterday. But for me, really the thing is, what is the bird? What are cities do? What's our role in this one? What is it that we need to do to get this going? Because it's really out of our control at some point. So
it's out of our control until it's in our control.
Yep.
So thank you, Meg. So a couple of quick things I want to note here. First of all, this only applies to state funds. I don't know if Steve brought that up yesterday or not, but I just want to emphasize that. I met with the Treasurers Association a couple of days ago, and the original version of this bill would have applied to the entire Public Treasurers Investment Fund, which includes all of your reserves. Ultimately, where they settled on was $300 million of just state funds to get it going. But where the cities come in on this bill is what is happening right now in a community in northern Utah that was in a public meeting earlier this week. And that is, in order for a builder to access these dollars, they have to meet certain affordability and homeownership requirements. So now we're making that pivot from modular and infrastructure districts, which were just general housing and trying to increase supply and unlock units. Now it's, how do we make sure we're getting the right type of units? And the League Board of Directors, which includes mayors and council members from North Logan to Hilldale and Salt Lake to Provo, they adopted some key principles last spring where they told us as staff, we want whatever housing bills that come out of the upcoming discussions to be really focused on affordable home ownership, sustainable infrastructure, quality of life. So House Bill 13 was all about the infrastructure piece. Now we're pivoting to that affordable home ownership link. And with House Bill 572, if a builder wants to access these dollars, and then a builder has to build 60% of the housing product at $450,000 or less, and they have to be owner occupied for at least 5 years. So where does the city come in to play here? Well, again, using the fact pattern that's taking place right now in a community in northern Utah, the builder already was entitled to X number of units. The builder went back to the land use authority and said, if we can essentially increase the density, in their case, they were increasing the density by about a third. So if they could increase the density by about a third, then we could meet this formula. We could meet this criteria. Now, the 5-year owner occupancy requirement is a floor, not a ceiling. So each individual community can figure out what that looks like. So again, using this case study from earlier this week, the discussion the land use authority is having with that builder is that they would actually have 50-year deed restrictions. So not 5, but 50. 50-year deed restrictions for owner occupancy. It would still be sold at that first home level. I'm just pulling up my other notes here. From a planning perspective, if a builder comes to you, this is really what you need to know. If a builder comes to you and says, I'm trying to access HB 572 funds, in order to do that, I have to hit these certain percentages of owner occupancy and affordability. City, in order to do that, I need this sort of planning, I need this type of density, I need this sort of cooperation. And then the statute requires an agreement between the local government and the builder that they're going to meet those outcomes and ensure those outcomes, and then those dollars can start flowing to the builder. I know at this point of at least 5 banks that have expressed interest in accessing these dollars to provide those dollars to regional builders and local builders. So I do anticipate in the weeks to come that builders are going to be coming to City Hall and saying, we'd like to access these dollars. This is the type of product we need to do. Can we work together to build out a plan for it? Meg, because I wasn't here yesterday, does that address what you were looking for?
Yeah, I think Steve said it just needed to be an agreement. It's not an entitlement.
Yeah, it needs to be an agreement.
And so that's sort of the distinction.
Yeah, that needs to be an agreement. And actually, as we were having this discussion with the city attorneys yesterday about is it a development agreement, is it an RDA agreement, what sort of agreement is it? And then we were also talking through with the attorneys yesterday the sequence of these types of agreements. And that applies to 572 plus the third category of bills we'll talk about in a moment. The sequence of this does matter, and you want to make sure that you're at least trying to do these types of agreements and entitlements simultaneously. So if you're working with the builder is going to need some assurance that they're going to get the zoning that they need and the entitlements that they need in order to build the housing product that qualifies for the money. We as a city want to make sure that if we are going to grant those entitlements, they are actually going to build these units. And you don't want to create a scenario where the city does the zoning and then the builder says, never mind, I'm not going to access these dollars after all, and I'm just going to build them at market rate. Conversely, you don't want to create a scenario where the builder does everything that they need to do, and then last minute says, never mind, we're not going to do the zoning, and the builder's stuck because they've done everything that they need to do to qualify for the money, and then they can't get the money. So working through these processes simultaneously would be really important to make sure there's certainty on all sides so that the builder can meet their obligations, the lender can meet their obligations, and the city fulfills our commitments.
Questions?
Yep, go ahead.
Question on the deed restrictions and the owner occupancy requirements. Is there an entity that would be taking on the oversight of that? Is it a housing authority? How is that being enforced in perpetuity?
Yep, excellent question. I should also note that there is not a specific density requirement in House Bill 572 or a floor, whereas there will be in the bills I'm about to get to. So just kind of finishing the answer to Meg's question, I should have mentioned that there's kind of maximum flexibility there to figure that out. So then coming to your question on the deed restriction. I just finished my 16th legislative session representing the league at the Capitol. And it's not the years, it's the miles. Like it adds up and it gets harder and harder each year. I have never before heard the term deed restriction at the Capitol as much as I did this year. And that was in part a recognition that if we are really targeting affordable home ownership, that you need some sort of enforcement mechanism. And I give a lot of credit to the Property Rights Coalition and the realtors and the home builders and the folks who normally cringe when they hear the term deed restriction, because they acknowledge that in order to make this work, a deed restriction is one of those enforcement tools. And so they were willing to have that conversation. So I give them props to that. The other piece of it was we wanted to make sure that these units didn't turn into corporate-owned units, and we didn't want them to turn into vacation rentals or anything that takes away from the objective of affordable home ownership. Okay, so we're all agreeing on the outcome, and it's a matter of how you enforce the outcome. We tried to leave the statute flexible so that North Logan could approach the deed restriction differently than St. George. And we went back and forth on how restrictive to put language in code about how to do the deed restriction, because at the end of the day, I don't know if North Logan has the capacity to handle deed restrictions at City Hall. You're shaking your head no. Okay, Mayor Peterson told me the same thing, so you guys are on the same page. There are some communities that have that capacity. There are some communities that have housing authorities. The state of Utah actually administers thousands of deed restrictions with housing that receives federal financing. So at the end of the day, as these projects come forward, that is a conversation that will have to happen at City Hall between the city and the builder of who's going to manage the deed restrictions. Will the builder do it? Will it be a third-party nonprofit? Will it be a housing authority? Will it be the state of Utah? That's something that will have to be figured out in the agreement process. So that was a very long way to say it depends. Any other questions? Yep, go ahead.
In the subject of long-term viability of neighborhoods and resiliency, all the planning buzzwords, 60% first home levels. I mean, you're putting a lot of smaller homes, more affordable homes in one location. Has there been any conversation about what that might turn into 10, 15, 20, 30 years down the road? Or is there any incentives or drawbacks or financing problems or challenges in asking a developer to incorporate them a little bit better into other neighborhoods with more higher priced homes?
Yeah, excellent question. This gets to the mix of neighborhoods. And this was also part of a lot of behind the scenes conversations during the session. And that 60% number with this tool is a little different than the percentages that I'll share when I get to the tax increment tools. And there was general agreement from both the home building community, the realtors, and local governments that you didn't just want to have starter homes here and everybody else there, that we wanted to have integrated communities. And so that 60% number was an effort to try to say this is going to be the mix, that you're going to have other housing units that receive these dollars that will be market rate or above market rate to try to get that mix. And I think this is where that agreement comes into play, because so much of this is going to come back to design and so much of this is going to come back to quality. And that you could have a small house next to a big house, and if the small house is a high quality home, even if it's smaller, you're achieving that integration piece, but you're also preserving the sustainability of that neighborhood over time. So I think that's partly why there's flexibility built in the statute, both with 572 funding and the tax increment funding, is so you can have this conversation at City Hall. again, that 60% number here is a little different than the ratios we have in the other bills. And I think as we go forward implementing these bills, we'll see how the market responds, and we'll see how the conversations go to see if this is the right mix or not. Thought I saw a hand. Yep.
What state entity does deed restrictions?
It's through the Department of Workforce Services and the Division of Housing and Community Development. So Christina Oliver, who was here yesterday, it's her division.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Brandon, do you have a question?
Just thinking about the general concepts in this, we're looking at, owner occupancy, and then Charlie brought up the issue of, diversity of housing type within different neighborhoods. And what we're sort of trending towards this topic of walkable communities and form-based code. And we've essentially outlawed huge components of form-based code in state code because of the design restrictions that went into place. And so that's coming back to affect affordability. And we need to we need to revisit that issue at some point with the legislature to show, hey, if we can provide additional ownership options for, different building types, and then re-enable form-based code by, revisiting that design restrictions for single-family homes, there's actually affordability opportunities there.
Yeah, it's a great point, and what he's referencing that hopefully everybody remembers is House Bill 98 from a few years ago that preempted a lot of the design standards that local governments had, and frankly, that bill was not unique to Utah. That bill, in some form or fashion, has passed in the majority of legislatures around the country. Since that bill's passage, we have asked the question repeatedly, whether it's at the Commission on Housing Affordability or in other meetings behind the scenes, has this actually resulted in decreased housing prices? Has that bill resulted in more housing affordability? And there's not a clear answer one way or the other. We pointed out similar to the answer I just gave you about how design matters. And design, if you have good design, that makes density an easier pill to swallow for residents who are concerned about it. And there are some at the Capitol who acknowledge that. There are others who don't. So we've brought it up repeatedly, and even as we were negotiating these bills, we were bringing up the idea of tying design standards back into them. And ultimately, I think that was one step too far during the legislative session, but it's still something that's going to be discussed. Now, one caveat to what I just said is that while you can't require design standards in your base zoning, you can do design standards through development agreements. And all of these types of financing tools are going to require some sort of agreement. So I could see a scenario where in Pleasant View or any other community, we're working through this with developers, say, great, we're gonna do our pieces here on the density side, we're gonna do our pieces on the infrastructure and on setbacks, and we're gonna do our part to make this work so that you can get the affordable home ownership units built and fulfilled, but we want to also see some design standards, and you can negotiate those in development agreements. So it's project by project rather than city policy, and that tool is still available through development agreements.
Let me just mention that it's a quick burn rate. We don't have this, it has to be implemented.
Oh, yes, yeah, Jason just referenced there is a ticking clock on House Bill 572. I need to remind myself.
June 30, 2027.
But it doesn't have to be. Doesn't the money have to be sent? The money has to be sent out, and then it can be spent beyond that. But the money, this $300 million, all has to be out by, is it 2027?
Yeah.
So right?
Yeah, it's the earlier of the idea is that the state treasurer would work with a qualified depository, so a bank. They would identify a qualified project, and they would deposit the monies into that, up to the $300 million. Each depository could get up to $60 million of that component. But then, under agreement, they would have to lend those monies out to a qualified project, the earlier of which the monies have to come back from that project 24 months from when the loan is made. or at the latest when all the homes are sold, or June 30th, 2027. So it'll be interesting to see how this is utilized, because it's a very short time frame. Again, I think it's very much a short-term construction financing tool, again, to unlock many of those housing units that are already approved that just haven't been able to financially move the needle to get it to move forward. One other thing I just mentioned on this is the incentive to the developer is that the loan that would come with this from the depository would be a product of the federal funds rate plus a spread. But what would have to be returned back to the state is something that would be sub Fed funds rate. And so the differential is really the gap, which the state is saying we'll take less interest on this portion if we can get housing starts completed. So the developer, in essence, would have a qualified project, go to the qualified depository, and they would get, in essence, funding for infrastructure or improvements at the federal funds rate, right now 5.25, less 200 basis points. So they'd get financing for 3.5%. And that's probably where developers are going to be most interested in that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Jason, for bringing up the shot in the arm concept that underlies this, that this really is an attempt to stimulate the market due in part to the high interest rates, but not just stimulate the market generally, stimulate the market with that particular outcome in mind, which is why I do anticipate that builders who already have entitled units in your city, like the one I'm describing from earlier this week, may come back to you and say, I know you entitled me for X, but if we can go through this and change it to Y, I can access these dollars and ensure the affordable home ownership piece. So again, if you get builders approaching you about House Bill 572 funding, please let us know, because we want to monitor how it's going, and we want to be able to report back to the legislature how it's going. Any other questions about 572 funding before we pivot to tax increment? All right, going once, going twice, but I'm not going to say sold, because if an idea or question does pop into your mind, feel free to bring it back up.
And just in the interest of time, we do, believe it or not, have only like 15 more minutes. So I don't know, Cameron,
really?
if you want to ask what of the three, if you want to bring the three back, which tool that has the most interest, or do you want to just start with the hops? Anyone burning to get into one of the three other tools?
Hops, Fizz, or HDRZ? I was planning to do hops, then Fizz, then HDRZ.
Okay.
So do we? I thought we went till later, but
No.
we just.
Okay. Till 11:30.
I think we go to 12:15, but there's a break
Oh.
for anyone that wants to go out to the session that starts at 11:15.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was over at 11:30. So I guess we have until noon.
Okay. Okay. Well,
My
either
miss-
way, I can talk forever. So, but you need not feel obligated to stay here forever. So, Meg, let's just do this. Maybe when we get to the break time to get into the third session, I just open the doors. I'll pause then, and then if people want to come and go, they can. Does that work?
Yep.
Okay.
Let's get into the hops.
Okay, let's talk hops. And before I get into the specific details here, let me talk through where these three tax increment tools originated. HDRZ is not new. There are several HDRZ proposals already underway. The tool was designed and enacted back in 2021, and we are just now starting to see some really cool projects get proposed through that HDRZ mechanism. And there are several problems the tax increment financing is trying to solve. Problem number one is just the upfront cost of infrastructure. We were, again, with that 190,000 data point where we were saying we have lots of housing units that are entitled and they're just stuck. The legislature said, okay, how do we unlock those housing units? And then we pointed out that of those 190,000 units, the vast majority of them were stuck because of infrastructure costs, both for the developer and then for the city. So tax increment financing is a way to have a revenue stream in order to bond for infrastructure costs. That's problem number one. Problem number two is that historically, There have been a variety of different tax increment tools out there, some focused heavily on economic development or redevelopment, but there's never really been a focus of using tax increment on housing per se. And there are a variety of reasons for that. One reason is just the property tax differential between residential property and non-residential property, and 100% taxable value versus a much lower amount. Another reason for that is that through the years there have been different processes to go about creating tax increment financing districts, and sometimes you need to have all the property taxing entities together and create a taxing entity committee, and sometimes you need to do this process, sometimes you need to do that process. Now we know that there's been frustration between cities and other property taxing entities around the use of tax increment financing. We also have been seeing a trend as of late where there have been some other taxing entities that have refused to participate in tax increment financing deals if they included housing. So then that puts the city in a really tricky spot, that the legislature is pounding cities to use your tools to facilitate housing. Tax increment financing is one of those tools to facilitate redevelopment, pay for infrastructure, but some taxing entities were refusing to participate in any deals that included housing. So as we were trying to figure out how to solve all these myriad of problems, that led us back to HTRZ, which again is a 3-year-old tool, but how the HTRZ has resulted in some really good projects that have met the quote-unquote but-for test, that but for this tax increment, you would not be able to maximize the land and the project in the way you could without that tax increment without those tax increment dollars being available. So the HTRZ tool became the basis for the FIZ. Separate from that, you have the HOPS. I'm actually going to start with the HOPS first, because the HOPS is the smaller tool designed for 10 acres or less. It does not require an HTRZ committee. It does not require really any sort of committee. It's actually a tool that cities can use basically unilaterally, where you identify, working with the builder, an area that's 10 acres or smaller, and say the city meets certain requirements and the builder meets certain requirements, and you provide notice to the other taxing entities. Then at that point, the city in that 10-acre or smaller zone can collect a portion of the tax increment for up to 15 years to pay for infrastructure. Specifically, I've got my handy dandy cheat sheet that we will be distributing shortly through Friday Facts and otherwise, but specifically with SB 168, the requirement on the builder is the housing has to be affordable, so 80% or less of the median county home price for housing of that type. So the definition of affordability is based on median county home price. And the definition of ownership is 60%. So this gets back to the 572 definition, that 60% has to meet that definition. And then the ownership requirement, similar to House Bill 572, is a 5-year requirement. So that's the floor. At least 5 years, has to be owner-occupied. At least 60% of the units have to do that, have to meet the owner-occupied requirements. And then the affordability component is 80% based on the county median price. The requirement on the city is that you have to zone for at least 6 units to the acre. And before you ask, what does that mean, gross or net? The answer is it depends. We actually went back and forth on that in several meetings of whether or not to define 6 units to the acre as gross or net in statute, and we ultimately left statute silent to provide the maximum flexibility for the builder and for the city to figure out what project could potentially work, okay? So the city's requirement is at least 6 units to the acre, residential for up to 10 acres. The developer requirement is at least 5 years owner occupancy, and the affordability requirement of at least 60% of the housing units have to be 80% of the county median price or below. And if you have a meeting of the minds for that project, then the city can collect up to looking for my cheat sheet, make sure I get it right, but it was up, memory serves, it was up to 60%. Yep, up to 60% of the aggregate tax increment for up to 15 years. So that's partly the city's tax increment in that increase in value, but it's also the county and the school district and others. So collect up to 60%, and then they have to use that on infrastructure. So the idea here is if the city can be able to pledge that tax increment money, gives them a tool to pay for those upfront infrastructure costs, that then gets a variety of housing types, but particularly the affordable home ownership units built, that in turn improves overall housing affordability. And then let's say you're Cameron City, and this area of your city you've zoned 2 units to the acre, and you would now upzone it to 6. Part of our conversation was knowing that you may have residents who are concerned about going from 2 to 6. This now allows the council members to say, if we do this, the majority of those housing units are going to be affordable home ownership units. So they're not going to turn into corporate ownership. They're not going to turn into vacation rentals. These are going to be first homes, owner-occupied homes, and filling this need in our community. So it gives them an additional point of emphasis to communicate to community members rather than just increasing density for the sake of increasing density. So let me pause there. The hops, well, actually, let me add one other piece to the hops. The hops is maxed out at 10 acres, okay? So each hops parcel can be no larger than 10 acres. But there's an aggregate cap, and this is important, okay? Because really what we're talking about is when the city does the rezone and the value of the property goes up and there's going to be increased tax revenue, that the counties and the school districts and others are going to get less than they otherwise would for a period of time. So acknowledging that is critical. There's a requirement you have to provide notice to all the taxing entities if you're going to go forward with the hops. But we also recommended an aggregate cap by school district because school districts have the largest amount of property tax. And the idea around the aggregate cap is to provide some certainty to the other taxing entities that this is the largest amount of tax increment that could be that could be set aside for the hops. There are 2 caps. Cap number 1 is for multi-city school districts. Cap number 2 is for single city school districts. So my hometown of Murray is a single city school district. So the cap there is 50 total acres can be utilized as a hops. If you go to a multi-city school district like Jordan School District or Davis School District, then the aggregate cap is 100 acres. Part of the rationale here is, let's take Davis County, for example. Davis School District is all of Davis County, so 100 acres could go like that. And that's part of the intent, is ideally communities within Davis School District and the cities within Davis County say, okay, we're going to work together with this builder. The builder's brought this project, and so there'll be 7 acres here and 9 acres here, 6 acres here and 10 acres there with that maximum cap of 100 acres. And ideally this tool pays for infrastructure, which then facilitates that affordable home ownership requirement. The big unanswered question, maybe the billion-dollar question, is will there be enough money generated from this increment to pay for the necessary infrastructure? And the answer, like with all things, is it depends. We did some analysis partnering with Jason's team during the session to try to figure out that question. And really, as we looked at different cities, in some cities, if it was a 10-acre development at certain densities with other certain factors, it generated a significant amount of money. In other places, it didn't. So it really does depend. And one thing I've been trying to emphasize over the last few weeks at the Capitol is that these are not one-sided tools. These tools require 2 to tango. A city could go out and say, we want to do a hops here, but if a builder's not willing to meet those criteria, it doesn't work. Likewise, if a builder says, I really want to do a hops, and comes into City Hall and wants to do it, and the city doesn't do their part, it doesn't work. So it really takes 2 to tango, and it's an opportunity for us to show that partnership with the private sector to try to achieve affordable home ownership. Let me stop there on the hops, and I think we're getting close to the where we're going to take that short break anyway before we pivot to Fizz, HTRZ, and just general questions. But questions about the hops. Let's go, Dennis. Oh, nope, let's go back by Meg.
So my question is, why is the 80% tied to the median sale rather than AMI, which is what our threshold is for, or our standard is for affordable housing? We plan on the Wasatch back, and I can tell you the 80% of the county median sales price is not affordable in any way to our citizens if we look at the 80% AMI. And so I guess that's my question. I was really excited about this opportunity or this idea of this, but looking at that one thing, I don't know that that's actually going to be a solution for us.
Well, keep in mind it's a floor, right? Like it's the starting point for the discussion. But we went back and forth on this definition a lot because, for better or for worse, there is inconsistency around what affordability means depending on the tool. So we've been working on a chart, on a table that will help you have a quick cheat sheet. It's what I keep referring to on my computer to make sure I'm remembering them correctly, because some are based on AMI and some are going to be based on the county median price. This was the subject of a lot of discussions behind the scenes over which place to start, and ultimately kind of the consensus was do the median price, recognizing it's a floor. So whether you're in Heber or Park City or anywhere else on the Wasatch back, 80% of $2 million in Park City is not going to be affordable, but it's the starting point. And as you come to an agreement with the city, because the city's the one that's got to create the zone, the city could say, okay, we're willing to do this, but it's not going to fly at 80% of the median price. It needs to be 50% of the median price in order to make this work. But in other places around the state, that 80% was actually a better number than the 80% AMI, and was actually easier to track than the AMI number was.
Cameron, real quick, the first bullet point under tax increment, will you just make that very clear? We are now mandating that school districts have to approve these, or?
Yep. Yep. So this gets back to the point I was making before of one of the problems that we were trying to address, and that was that other taxing entities have been hesitant to participate in tax increment financing deals that include housing. So the legislature said, okay, if we're going to create these tools that are focused on housing, everybody's got to have skin in the game. And so yes, the other taxing entities are compelled to participate, but that's why there's the aggregate cap. So if you're as I mentioned, if you're a multi-city school district, you know that the most tax increment that could come out from the hops is 100 acres. But they are compelled to participate, and the statement from legislative leadership and the governor's office and others was we need everybody to have skin in the game. So we need the cities on the planning side to meet these obligations and to have these conversations with residents. We need the other taxing entities to be willing to contribute their tax increment to pay for infrastructure for these housing units. And we need the builders to build units that may have lower profits, likely will have lower profits in order to meet it. If all those pieces don't come together, the tool doesn't work. Okay, Meg.
One more, yep.
One
more question.
Another question here, and then we'll just take a quick break.
Well, the break came and went, so we're just going to roll through.
Oh, break came and went. All right, that's great.
Cameron, these HOPS criteria, can they be delineated by a city in a development agreement,
Yes.
or would they need to be in ordinance form?
Development agreement or through your RDA agreement. But yes, you will need some sort of written agreement because it's going to be really project by project.
So we don't have to put it in ordinance and adopt it. It can be done with a development agreement.
I mean, do you have?
Well, let's just say, for instance, that the city wanted to say, we want this owner occupied for 10 years.
Sure.
Can that be done in a development agreement?
Yes, because they have to sign it. And this is a key piece. So several years ago, we had a lengthy discussion through the Commission on Housing Affordability around inclusionary zoning. And in some places around the country, inclusionary zoning has been a really good tool to increased the number of affordable units. In other places, the inclusionary zoning ordinances have actually stifled development. So the research is actually pretty mixed on this. And we went back and forth that whole interim of what is the role of base zoning and inclusionary zoning versus development agreements and inclusionary zoning. And ultimately, where the legislature weighed in on inclusionary zoning, and when I say inclusionary zoning, I'm talking about a governmental requirement to sell certain housing units at below market rates, which is basically what this is. But the difference here is it's a meeting of the minds. This is done by agreement. A builder is knowingly entering into this agreement that they're going to sell for less, and they're getting access to tax increment financing for infrastructure, and the city's doing their part, so it's a meeting of the minds, as opposed to inclusionary zoning that you see in other states where it's in your base zone that we are going to require that 10% of all housing units in this zone have to be set aside as affordable. So the legislature came in and said, cities, you cannot, in base zoning, do inclusionary zoning. There are some exceptions to that, actually on the Wasatch Back and in Moab, but you can't do it inclusionary, but you can do inclusionary zoning principles through development agreement. And kind of that thought process also helped inform the HOPS and the FIZ and the HTRZ.
Cameron?
And 572.
Similar, right here, similar to Jeff's question, and maybe why Jeff asked it. We use the word zone for a myriad of different definitions, but then under CLUDMA and LUDMA, zone means something very specific.
Yeah.
I'm assuming this is just zone means area under this title.
Correct.
So we're not adopting a zone.
Yeah, and we tried to figure out a different term, and because HTRZs, Housing and Transit Reinvestment Zone, use the zone piece, and that was, that's a tax increment tool that does compel participation by others, and we're basing things off of that. We stuck with the term zone. But yeah, thank you for that clarifying question. Okay, before I pivot to the FIZ and the HTRZ and just general questions, I do want to thank you for all these questions. I've written down a couple of things where we will make sure to clarify these in the white papers that we're working on, so it's really helpful for us. We meet all the time with Wilf and with Scott. They're great advocates for the planners in general. Angela Price, who used to be in APA leadership, now is the government relations director for Salt Lake City, is involved in a lot of our discussions at the Capitol and brings a planner's perspective. Meg Ryan is a planner by trade and is our planning expert as we negotiate these bills year round. So I bring that up because we welcome your participation, whether it's notifying Scott and Wilf and Meg, or just calling us directly, or as we put together work groups that we'll be announcing at LPC in a couple of weeks. We want the perspective of on-the-ground planners. And I mentioned with House Bill 13 that we had almost a 2-year work group that included managers and administrators and planners and elected officials to try to figure out how we could get to a workable spot. With modular housing, we had a work group that included quite a few city officials to try to get these bills to a workable spot. And that's really what we do year round. That's why it's a year-round legislature, is because we're working on these tools. And I can tell you right now that tax increment financing is going to be, again, examined in detail this summer, because I expect that, I know we got a few things wrong, just candidly. There'll be things that will need to be fixed and improved in these bills. So if you want to continue the conversation we're having today through the interim and provide your perspective on planning issues in general, we welcome your participation. Just grab me, grab Meg, make sure we've got your contact info, and make sure you've signed up for Friday Facts. Okay, let's pivot then to HTRZ and FIZ. I'm going to actually start with HTRZ with the caveat that that only applies around transit, but it's the foundation of what became the FIZ. HTRZ, Housing and Transit Reinvestment Zones, again, have been in law for 3 years. And this gets to Dennis's question earlier about other taxing entities being compelled to participate. The HTRZ tool is designed to try to maximize land around frontrunner tracks and BRT stations. It's an optional tool. The city, just like all these other tools we're talking about, the city creates a plan that is within 1/3 of a mile of the transit stop. And within that plan, the city has to meet certain density requirements, at least 50 units to the acre The builder in turn has to meet certain affordability requirements, and then we changed the law this year to include consideration for owner-occupied housing. There's not a threshold, but it has to include the consideration of it. Then once the city formulates the plan, and this is a key distinction from the HOPS, the city then has to go get approval from a state-created HTRZ committee. So whereas with the HOPS, the city does not need to create a taxing entity committee of any sort. The city can just approve the HOPS in those small areas. You have to provide notice to the other taxing entities. You need to make sure to meet with them, and my strong recommendation is to meet with them in advance. Make sure they're aware of what you're looking to do, and there may be a way to do it a different way without using the HOPS tool. With the HTRZ and the FIZ, approval comes from a state-created taxing entity committee that's known as the HTRZ committee. It includes several legislators, and it will include all of the taxing entities. So when Dennis asked the question about school districts will now actually have 2 representatives on an HTRZ committee. And the HTRZ committee reviews both HTRZ proposals and FIZ proposals. So at the HTRZ committee, the HTRZ committee is basically examining this but-for test. But for providing this tax increment, the infrastructure want to get built, this project want to get off the ground. And I'll give you a specific example of where this has come to fruition. In Vineyard, they've been working on an HTRZ that recently got approved that isn't just 50 units to the acre. It'll actually be over 80 units to the acre, and they'll have about 12% of those units be set aside as affordable units, but it's a massive transformation of the land adjacent to the front runner site. And it will be a really tremendous transit-oriented development. The other property taxing entities will have skin in the game. They will have to commit taxing. I don't remember the specifics of what they agreed to, but it can be up to 25 years worth of increment during a 45-year window. And the HDRZ committee can determine those parameters. There are caps on the HTRZ, and the caps apply in Salt Lake County, that there's a maximum of now 11 within Salt Lake County of HTRZs and FIZs. So for most communities in the state, HTRZ is just a cute 4-letter acronym because you don't have front runner, you don't have tracks, you don't have BRT. But that model is the foundation for the FIZ, and the FIZ could apply anywhere in the state. So any questions about HTRZ before we jump to the FIZ? Okay, let's talk some FIZ. Okay. I talk with my hands anyway. I have to talk with my hands when I do the FIZ. If HTRZ is the tool to maximize the land near transit and really maximize the residential and commercial density around transit, then you could think of the FIZ as the tool to try to maximize the planning outcomes around other types of non-transit centers. So whether that's Redwood Road or US 89 or other commercial centers in your community that don't have tracks, don't have front runner, and it doesn't matter if you're small town or big city, the FIZ is a tool that you could potentially use to develop what I'll term as medium density centers. The city would design the zone of up to 100 acres. And that zone has to be a mixed-use development. Well, fun fact, most of our commercial centers nowadays are trending mixed use anyway. So as you are considering that mixed-use center, the majority of the acreage has to be housing, and then you have to meet a minimum density of 30 units to the acre. But that 30 units to the acre does not all have to be at that medium density center. This is the term of extraterritorial areas, which we said all the time during the sessions, extraterrestrial areas, ET areas, whatever is easier for you to remember. But you've got your residential neighborhoods outside the center. So you've got your center here and your residential areas out there, okay? The center has to hit the 30 units to the acre. But this is a math equation. If you've got 30 units to the acre, and I'm just gonna use simple math because I'm an attorney, not a math guy. 30 units to the acre, and you have 10 acres of housing. 30 times 10 is 300, but you don't need all 300 to be in the center. You can have half of those units out in your other neighborhoods. Those other neighborhoods have to be zoned at least 6 units to the acre. Okay, so there's the consistency with the hops we were saying before. So let's say in Cameron City, this area over here is zoned 2 units to the acre. But we're going to upzone it to 6 units to the acre. And let's say it's 10 acres. So now you've gone from the potential of 20 units to 60 units. That 40 units can now be counted toward the 300 that you need in your center. And you've now connected this zone in the center with those residential areas. With respect to the overall project, as you've designated this 100 acres for your center, you can approach the HDRZ committee to collect the tax increment in the same ratio as the HDRZ, 25 years, up to 25 years for up to a 45-year window, and you can collect that tax increment to pay for infrastructure, not just in the center, but pay for infrastructure over here and over here and over here. So in my example of the 2 units to the acre that's now become 6, you're going to need more pipes, you're going to need more sidewalks, you're going to need more infrastructure over here. You can use the tax increment from the center to pay for the infrastructure needs in the ET areas. So now, not only do you have a tool for the mixed use development, you've got a tool for mixed use development and to do some upzoning in other parts of your city. So that's the requirement on the city side. But the requirement on the developer side, stop me if you've heard this before, the developer has to meet certain requirements around owner occupancy and affordability. So, this is the complicated math for it that I think I did a better job simplifying. But a certain percentage of the owner occupied, or a certain percentage of the overall units have to be owner occupied and they have to be affordable. 25% within the center, 100% outside in the EZ areas, and then have to be owner occupied, and then at least 20% of them have to be affordable. Now, these were the original graphics that we put together to try to explain it during the session. We will have a cleaner version in the white papers that'll be circulated, if not in Friday Facts today, then next week. But really the key core concept here is medium density center that's mixed use. Housing that's out here in the other parts of the city, if the city meets certain density requirements, can count toward the center, which then would trigger the ability to collect the tax increment here and pay for infrastructure here and there. Then the builder has to meet certain affordable home ownership requirements here and there, and the owner-occupied affordable requirements are higher out in the neighborhoods. Let me pause there before I keep going to see what questions folks have about the FIZ. There's a question right there in the middle of the room.
What is the distance of how far out that can be applied in the neighborhood of that center?
How big is your city?
Well,
so again, this is the ultimate key here is flexibility. So as long as it's within your city, you can apply the center density to those other areas and use the infrastructure. Okay. Or use the infrastructure money from the TIF.
Very good, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
So the question I've heard most is this: how the heck do we even begin doing this? And I think to break down for us is that if we have a planned center that we're working on, a mixed-use center, it's how to build this into that. It's not something new that we may not have thought of. It's things that we're thinking about. How do we build this into that? Is that fair?
Yes, and we at the league office have a floor-to-ceiling map of the Wasatch Choice vision. And it has centers that have been highlighted all over it. Some of those centers currently exist. Some of those centers are being redeveloped. Some of those centers exist on a map only because they're greenfield. This type of tool potentially could help with any of those categories. So as the city is putting together those plans for those centers, you could say, okay, if we use this tool, can we use some of the tax increment financing that we're going to be able to collect from this area? Can we use some of that center revenue to help pay for infrastructure in other parts of the city? And that may be just right next to the center. It may be 5 miles away. I mean, that's where there is ultimate flexibility for the city to figure out how do we maximize these dollars to pay for the infrastructure needs that we have in the community. Again, the builder has to meet certain requirements. And I keep saying the builder. I should also note that within the FIZ that realistically you're talking about the builders, because you're likely going to have multiple developers and multiple builders involved in these conversations. Jason, do you want to add something? I don't have a mic here.
Can you hear? I'd just add to that too, Cam, that this is a great tool in terms of mixed-use development where a city might be considering a CRA, a community reinvestment area, which is a traditional tax increment financing district, where perhaps you've had difficulty with the school district or the county or other participants who have just not been warm to or accepting of those types of tools. I think if you've got a mixed use that promotes all of the things that you've talked about, we've seen where this might really be a project financing that would really get the project going. We like the fact that the emphasis isn't only on first or home ownership or home affordability, but it also speaks to the idea of sustainability, economic viability of communities that have mixed use. We need all different land uses, really, to effectively be financially sustainable. And so this tool, I think, it really ought to be considered when a CRA might be the other alternative and just doesn't seem like it has much local participation or motivation. This could be a great way to do it.
Perfect. Well, thank you for bringing that up, Jason. And a key distinction with the HDRZ and the FIZ compared to the HOPS is your plan has to be approved by the HDRZ committee. So the other taxing entities have a voice there within that committee, and your plan needs to pass muster. And the hope is that what will happen is you'll look at your general plan for the city, you'll look at where you've planned for different centers, and you'll build out the type of plan that I was just describing in Vineyard that comes to the HDRZ committee and ultimately will lift all taxing entities and be a huge asset for your community and provide sustainability, commercial development, and that necessary residential development. We also think this FIZ is the first of its kind in the country of where you're taking an increment from this spot and using it over here for affordable home ownership. And so that's why I acknowledge that I'm sure we've gotten some things wrong. Like I already know as we've been pouring over these bills, again, outside of the pressure cooker of the session, that we need to make some tweaks to certain words that were used in the wrong spot, little drafting errors. But we're hopeful that these tools in the aggregate give local governments and builders alike some different ways to pay for infrastructure and to finance housing to unlock housing units that have either been planned for now or to facilitate conversations about planning for housing units in the future. Meg, I've been talking for a long time. What other questions do you have either about these bills, the legislature in general, housing affordability, anything and everything? What it's like to be in the pressure cooker of the session, whether Utah's going to win the Big 12 this fall, and any questions for me? And the answer to the last question is yes, they are.
Yes, and now we do really have 15 minutes left, so we can take it. Are there any questions, any thoughts on anything, any upcoming thoughts of upcoming legislation? I wanted to throw out parking. Oh, you have a question? Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know if maybe I'm just trying to wrap my head around all of this, but is there, if for example our community already has a CRA, RDA, is there an opportunity to overlay fizz? Do they work in conjunction? Can they work in conjunction? I'm not sure if that's even feasible.
The answer is that the law does allow for stacking. Whether or not there's enough money to stack is a different question, but the law does allow for stacking, and I can't really give you a more specific answer without knowing what you already have in place, but it's still worth looking. Jason, you want to speak on that? Because this was an issue we worked on quite a bit during the session, is how these could go together.
Yeah, I could give one example. There might be a circumstance where the CRA creates a community reinvestment area, uses a fizz for the property tax element, but uses other maybe incremental taxes that are generated within an area. For instance, we see that in Salt Lake with this capital city reinvestment zone, the idea of the NHL coming. Salt Lake's permitted potentially to put an additional sales tax in place, and then that could be captured by virtue of the RDA, if you will, and utilized to finance different things. And so I could see an application where you could stack it, but I think the important point would be you wouldn't be able to add new taxes onto the property tax side. It would be bringing in the element of other tax revenues where you would stack it. And I see that's where the CRA probably would work with the fizz or some of these other tools.
Excellent. Thank you, Jason. Other questions while you've got us? I'm usually speaking at the Capitol, not at Hogwarts, so it's a nice change of pace. Yep.
Earlier on, there was a mention made that a bill for using eminent domain on the Bonneville Shoreline Trail failed. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about the background of that?
You betcha. Oh, you betcha. Okay, how many people like eminent domain? Yeah. Wow, even like the woo there. That was a nice touch. So eminent domain is a 4-letter word at the Capitol, and it's a 4-letter word basically anywhere, right? Like the reason none of you raised your hands is nobody wants to use eminent domain. Well, let me take you on a little trip down history lane, down memory lane. So back in 2007, we had some communities that were exercising eminent domain for linear parks, and ultimately the legislature stepped in there, and that's when they took away the authority for cities to use eminent domain there. And this was on the heels of the Kelo decision versus New London, and eminent domain was getting all sorts of national attention for quote unquote abuse of eminent domain. Well, what we have found since that time is there are a lot of trail systems in the state that could be connected, Bonneville Shoreline Trail being probably the most prominent, but it's not the only one, but for a handful of property owners, we're not able to connect these trails. So there have been multiple bills during my 16 years at the Capitol that have been trying to reverse that bill I described in 2007, the most recent one being the bill that just flat out called out the Bonneville Shoreline Trail. And so we're only going to talk about this one and not everything else. And couldn't even get a hearing because of the consternation around eminent domain. And I get it, right? Like legislators are people too. They don't want to make it easier to do eminent domain. And we've had a hard enough time trying to just hold on to the eminent domain authority we have for transportation and other things. But it is a sticky situation. Now, a couple years ago, the governor, and we were very supportive of this, created the Active Transportation Investment Fund, the ATIF. And the Active Transportation Fund was the first time in state history where the state strategically said we are setting aside, and that year was $99 million, $45 million one time, $45 million ongoing, the rest one time, to invest in a statewide trail system. So we actually brought up behind the scenes, if we're going to have this conversation around statewide trail system and regional trails, then we need to have the conversation about limited use of eminent domain. In the governor's press conference, which I attended, he was asked a question about eminent domain. I did not plant the question. I did not want a reporter asking him this question. The reporter asked him the question, and the governor said, we will not be using eminent domain for any of these trails. So it gives you a sense where he's at. So to me, it's one of those issues that we, on your behalf, we as a league will constantly raise the challenges of not having that tool in the toolbox has created. I hope springs eternal at the Capitol, but yeah, right now I don't see a viable path to restoring that eminent domain authority. But hope springs eternal, and we've probably had 6 or 7 bills now since 2007, and trying to attack it from different angles. And I think as the state continues to urbanize, and as there's growing demand for trails, we will continue to bring it up as part of the conversation and see where it goes. Anybody else while you've got me? Well, then let me, did I see a hand go up, or are you just scratching? Okay. Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of cool stuff that could be done with these tools or in combining these tools. Was the legislature anticipating that cities are going to sit back and wait for developers to approach cities? Or is it appropriate for a city to come up with different ideas, organize developers, and share these tools with them and actually try to focus on using them?
My strong recommendation is number 2. And I've said repeatedly for the last couple of hours that these bills require a meeting of the minds. And I think if nothing happens over the next year, the legislature will blame us more than they'll blame the private sector. Now, we can't do these tools unilaterally, but I strongly encourage you, when you go back to City Hall next week, to say, okay, do any of these tools, is there something viable in our community where these could work? And if the developer and builder's not interested, then that's what we want to know too. Like, hey, we were interested in Cameron City to maybe do this tool here, but we can't find a willing builder. Like, that would be helpful for us to know. Likewise, I expect builders, particularly with House Bill 13 and House Bill 572, to be coming to you, and we want to know about that too.
Follow-up question.
Yeah.
Are the state's major home builders aware of these bills? Or?
Oh, yes. Yeah, they were involved
okay.
in all the negotiations on them. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, and actually I should bring something up here because I think it's important for folks to know. We represent cities and towns, 255, and it's a great honor to represent mayors and council members and you and other staffers at the cities. And we appreciate the great work you do to make Utah a wonderful place to work, live, and play. And part of how we represent you is engaging in year-round dialogue with other stakeholders. I probably talk to a home builder or developer or their representatives daily during the off-season. Just this week, I've been in southern Utah the last 3 days hitting up different conferences, and I've been on the phone with 3 different developers or home builders talking about different issues, talking about these policies, talking about the Commission on Housing Affordability and other things. So we try to make sure there's always open communication. We certainly have a lot of battles, but we try to make sure there's open communication. Okay, I'm going to take advantage of the awkward silence to say, this is the list of potential topics that the legislature is going to be looking at. We've listed it as work groups. These may not turn into league work groups, but there's going to be work in all these different spaces. Some of these apply to you, some of them don't. But this just gives you a sense of the scope of work that happens between March and December as we prepare for January. So if you see something up here, you say, wow, my city would be very interested in that, please make sure Meg knows. There may be a work group, there may not, but it'd be helpful to know. Likewise, I mentioned this a few hours ago, but as a reminder, if there are problems that you'd like to address legislatively, we want to know about them. Wilf referenced a couple of bills, House Bill 465 and House Bill 476. Those bills took all year to negotiate, and there were things in those bills that came from you, that came from planners saying, we need to fix this piece. And to the credit of the home builders and the Property Rights Coalition, the realtors, et cetera, they agreed. And then there were things that they brought to us that they wanted to address, and we agreed. And we worked hard to find consensus on those items. So it's always helpful for us to know what is it that you are dealing with on the front lines that we can address. If nothing else, make sure you sign up for Friday Facts so you can stay aware of what's happening, and make sure your mayors and your council members and your city managers are aware of what's happening legislatively as well. Meg, what do you think? Do people want to go home?
I think that concludes this deep dive, but
Right.
there
Thank you for your
is
time.
always more. So reach out to us, and thank you guys. Thank you, Cameron.
Yep. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Amram. Thank you, everybody.